First of all, welcome to USIP. My name is Andrew Wilder. I'm a member of our Asia team here at the U.S. Institute of Peace. I'd also like to welcome those of you who are joining us online. It's good to see so much interest in our topic today. We were actually scheduled to have this in a smaller room, but we got so many RSVPs. Just about an hour ago, we decided to shift it into a larger auditorium. The only downside is that you can't bring your coffee in here, so we'll be reliant on our panelists to keep us awake. So no pressure. For those of you not familiar with USIP, we were founded in 1984 by Congress as an independent national institute dedicated to the proposition that peace is possible, practical, and essential for U.S. and global security. We pursue our mission by providing people, organizations, and governments with the tools, knowledge, and training to help manage conflict so it doesn't become violent, or to help resolve it when it does. The Institute has been deeply involved in Afghanistan since 2002 with a range of activities, working with civil society organizations, governments, but also part of our mission is to do events like this back here in Washington to raise more public awareness about the issues in countries in conflict, including in Afghanistan today, and also to help inform U.S. policymakers on issues in terms of managing violent conflict in the context like Afghanistan. We are excited to be hosting this significant event on the Afghanistan peace process today. It comes at an important moment in the efforts to reduce violence levels and achieve a negotiated and nonviolent end to the conflict in Afghanistan. Today's announcement by President Ghani on an Eid ceasefire makes today's discussion even more timely. I hope the Taliban see this as an opportunity to respond in kind and to signal that they are also interested in a peaceful resolution to the conflict, as they claimed in a letter to the American people earlier this year. The ceasefire announcement follows President Ghani's forward-leaning offer to the Taliban in February at the Kabul Peace Conference to find a solution to the conflict. This offer was backed a month later in the Tashkent Conference, which further consolidated international support for a peace process. The U.S. has also stated that one of the key objectives of the Afghanistan and South Asia strategy is a politically negotiated end to the Taliban-led insurgency. Just today, Secretary Pompeo reiterated the U.S. support for an Afghan-led peace process, and last week in a press conference, General Nicholson led off by stating categorically that the objective of the military campaign against the Taliban was to achieve a political settlement, not to win the war. So I also wanted to highlight how the key constituency, of course, wanting peace is the Afghan people themselves, the strongest supporters. In recent months, we are beginning to see widespread desire for peace on the ground taking form in remarkable movements such as the Peace Tent Movement and the March to Kabul, which I think should be arriving in Kabul in the next day or two. Also supported by religious leaders and other representatives of civil society. These remarkable individuals are risking their lives to help build a more peaceful future for their families, their community, and their country. Presently, current peace efforts approach this promising yet delicate topic from two angles. First, top-down efforts, or efforts building towards a broad political settlement involving the Afghan government and Taliban leadership, and secondly, bottom-up efforts, which involve the reintegration of individual fighters, demobilization of armed units, and local accommodations among belligerents. Our first panel today will focus on the top-down efforts, and the second panel will highlight some of the bottom-up efforts. As the title for today's event suggests, the search for peace in Afghanistan will be long and difficult. There is lots of room for skepticism about whether or not peace efforts will succeed. However, as I've noted in previous events like this here at USIP on peace efforts, while there is plenty of room for skepticism about a successful peace process, I remain even more skeptical that there is a military solution to this conflict. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. I also think there's a risk of being so skeptical that we miss out on opportunities. So I'm hoping that today's discussion also focuses amongst our panelists on trying to identify opportunities to move the peace process forward and not just dwell on analyzing the problems about why it won't work. Our tagline here at USIP is that peace is possible, and for the reasons I've just noted, I firmly believe that, while difficult, peace is possible in Afghanistan. We are very fortunate today to be able to bookend our event by senior representatives of the US government and the Afghan government. Currently, Ambassador Mohib is on a plane. We've just received notification that his flight is a little bit late, so we are hoping he will be here in time to make the closing remarks. That is the plan. But now it is my distinct pleasure to welcome to the podium Lisa Curtis, the Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for South and Central Asia at the National Security Council. Lisa was a good friend and partner of USIP during her long and illustrious career at the Heritage Foundation and has remained a valued partner since moving to the White House last year. So with that, welcome, Lisa.
All right, thank you very much for coming today, and thank you to the United States Institute of Peace for inviting me to talk. And special thanks to Andrew Wilder, who, as he said, has been a longtime friend and colleague, and especially congratulations on organizing such a timely meeting today, conference, and on an issue that's so critical to U.S. national security. In fact, the United States Institute of Peace has done extraordinary work through private talks, track 2 dialogues, and public events like today's that promote dialogue and generate policy ideas. So last year, I spoke at USIP on a panel with colleagues from the State Department and Defense Department, sort of outlining the broad contours of the U.S. South Asia strategy, which was announced last August. Now today, I will drill down on the most important aspect of that strategy, achieving a peace settlement. I'd like to begin by commending the national unity government of President Ghani and Chief Executive Abdullah for their courageous initiative announced earlier today to offer a temporary halt to offensive operations against the Taliban. This is a clear demonstration of the Afghan government's good faith desire for a genuine peace process. U.S. Commander in Afghanistan, General Nicholson, has directed U.S. forces to honor this ceasefire with the Taliban, though I would emphasize that operations against ISIS-K and al-Qaeda will continue. For too long, various peace efforts have focused on either conceptual frameworks or theoretical paths forward. This step, on the other hand, represents a significant tangible initiative with the real potential to reduce violence. We hope, as Andrew Wilder said, that the Taliban accepts the Afghan government's gesture and ceases attacks during this period. Doing so would represent an unprecedented step forward in the peace process. However, even if the Taliban does not reciprocate, this demonstration of the Afghan government's seriousness about a peace process will illustrate to all stakeholders which party bears primary responsibility for perpetuating this war. This ceasefire will also continue the momentum started at the Kabul Process Conference in February. At that conference, President Ghani presented a clear vision for peace. He emphasized that the Afghan government is ready to start a peace process without preconditions. He further expressed an openness to discuss constitutional amendments, a ceasefire, and recognition of the Taliban that are willing to participate in the process as political players. So President Ghani's remarks at the Kabul Process Conference, combined with today's announcement of the ceasefire initiative, demonstrate the Afghan government's willingness to undertake difficult steps toward a political settlement. The onus of responsibility is now on the Taliban to respond positively. So a peace process begins with all sides sitting down at the table. The United States is ready to participate in the discussion, but we cannot serve as a substitute for the Afghan government and the Afghan people. A political settlement must be negotiated through a process that is Afghan-led and Afghan-owned. Unfortunately, the Taliban's spring offensive announcement and wave of heinous attacks, especially those we've seen in Kabul, call into question the Taliban's interest in a peace process. The Taliban must understand that it can only achieve its goals at the negotiating table. And let me assure you that the U.S., for its part, prioritizes the pursuit of a peace process. Toward this end, we are following multiple lines of effort. Let me take just a few minutes to describe them. Regional engagement is central to our efforts. We must ensure Afghanistan's near and far neighbors all agree that Afghanistan should be stable and peaceful. This means obtaining buy-in from key regional stakeholders through engagements like the Kabul Process Conference, the Tashkent Conference, as well as other diplomatic efforts that we are pursuing on a bilateral basis. The concluding statement of the Kabul Process Conference made clear the international community's support for a practical plan for peace and reconciliation. Our second line of effort focuses on encouraging grassroots peace initiatives. This means working closely with the Afghan government to ensure that there are ways for Taliban fighters who are ready to stop fighting to return to civil society. This does not mean that we intend to recreate earlier efforts that were largely unsuccessful. One of these included the Afghanistan Peace and Reintegration Program, which serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of graft. Effective reintegration initiatives must not take a one-size-fits-all approach. In some areas, that will mean addressing local grievances that encourage local factions to support the Taliban. We will have to be creative and flexible in helping to foster local conditions that reduce incentives for continuing violence. Now, I want to emphasize that these local efforts must be driven by the Afghan government. The history of this conflict is littered with examples of well-meaning plans conceived in Western capitals that failed because we lacked the contextual understanding of the tribal dynamics or the local grievances that contributed to the violence. So we will support the Afghan government's efforts. We will not try to replace them. But we also recognize that in addition to supporting grassroots and local efforts for peace, that ultimately the Afghan government and the Taliban must come to a peace agreement. The U.S. continues to work with international partners and to explore all possible avenues to help get such a dialogue off the ground. Another important component to catalyzing a peace process is ensuring that Pakistan plays a constructive role. The fact is that the Afghan Taliban, including the Haqqani network, has enjoyed sanctuary in Pakistan throughout the past 16 years of conflict. We have asked for Pakistan's assistance in facilitating a peace process, and we have sought to understand Pakistan's own core security concerns and ensure that its interests are taken into account in any peace process. However, we have to be clear that Pakistan's interests are not served by a Taliban resurgence in Afghanistan. Pakistan has a fundamental responsibility to address the use of its territory by these malign actors. One can acknowledge Pakistan's complex security calculus without absolving it of its responsibility to do something about these malign actors. The last line of effort is encouraging better relations between the governments of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and we have certainly been encouraged by the reinvigorated dialogue between Kabul and Islamabad that has happened in recent months. So let me just end by acknowledging that, as Andrew Wilder stated, No one believes that there is a military solution to this conflict. But we do acknowledge that military force plays a role in helping to set conditions for an ultimate peace settlement. And we also believe that the Taliban will have to accept that they cannot achieve their own objectives on the battlefield. Of course, we recognize the scope of the challenge with which we are faced. And I think one positive point that we can look at today is the consensus within the Afghan government on the necessity for a peace process. Given the sheer brutality of this conflict and attacks by the Taliban and Haqqani network, including those that have recently taken place in Kabul, a natural reaction would be to pull back from talking about peace. However, as we saw in today's courageous ceasefire announcement, our Afghan partners are sustaining their focus and pursuing with persistence the goal of a peaceful solution. Thank you very much.
Accounted for? First of all, thank you very much to Lisa Curtis for your remarks. That was very illuminating. Lisa's performing admirable service to her country and to Afghanistan at the NSC. I'd say for maybe an average of 18, 19 hours a day, managing the administration's policy for all of South Asia. So we're very grateful to you for taking the time to be here. I'm Johnny Walsh. I'm a senior expert on Afghanistan here at U.S. Institute of Peace, focused on the peace process. Prior to that, I was at State for 10 years, most of that time working on the peace process in different capacities. I think this was already an interesting time for the peace process in light of President Ghani's offer, the series of conferences that have consolidated support for it, and especially the peace marches, the really remarkable phenomenon that's spread around the country. And now we have a particularly interesting day for a conversation like this in light of the ceasefire announcement. So there's a lot to discuss here. We will be grappling with the many obstacles to starting a peace process, I'm sure. But in addition to that, I'm hopeful that this panel can offer some new insight on the actual substance of a potential peace arrangement, if talks ever do get going. I think that is crucially important, even if talks haven't started yet, and it maybe has gotten less attention on all sides, and we have an excellent panel of experts to start exploring that. Briefly, Steve Brooking, I think you have biographies, but is currently heading the UN's efforts on the Afghan peace process as the Director for Peace and Reconciliation at UNAMA. He's previously a British diplomat, as plugged in to all parties to the conflict as anyone currently working out there. Rahmatullah Amiri, who I think is on Skype, though yes, there we go, okay. Yes, I think that's appropriate. He is an expert on the peace process in the Taliban at the Liaison Office, which is one of Afghanistan's most respected think tanks. He is coming to us at circa 10 p.m. from Kabul, so we're very grateful to you for staying up. I met him in Kabul. He really blew me away with his special level of insight into this topic, and for that matter, into the Taliban. And if you care to Google him later, you'll see he's a true profile in courage who has suffered more for what he's achieved than many of us ever have to. Laurel Miller, once my boss, senior political scientist at RAND, recently the acting SRAP responsible for the US government's peace efforts. And Barney Rubin, possibly this country's leading scholar of Afghanistan, I'd say, but much more than that, longtime policymaker, holder of many titles and positions that we couldn't even fit into the written bio, and a regular visitor at the many world capitals involved in this process in Track 2 dialogues going back decades now. So thank you, everyone, for being here. I wonder if we could start with remarks from the Kabbali's. So, Steve, if you'd be amenable.
Certainly. Firstly, I'd like also to say, how pleased the United Nations is to see the offer from, or the offer exactly, the imposition of a unilateral ceasefire or cessation of hostilities from President Ghani. I think that's very welcome, and obviously we hope that that will lead to a peaceful lead for all the people of Afghanistan. And also very much welcome the fact that the US military has agreed also to observe the same ceasefire. I think that's a good start. Also, secondly, perhaps a disclaimer that although I'm working for the United Nations, nothing I say should be taken as the policy of the United Nations. This is my sort of more of my personal views, having worked in Afghanistan for most of the last 17, 18 years. One of the questions which was touched upon is whether now is the right time for peace. To which I suppose the short answer is, well, it's always the time to be looking to achieve a peace deal, because the suffering that is going on is not getting any better. Civilian casualties have been high in the first part of this year. They were slightly down last year on previous years, but overall, they've been going up year after year after year, and it's the ordinary Afghans on both sides who are facing the problems. We have raised this with the Taliban. We pointed out that they claim this is a war against the foreign occupation, but actually, if you look at the statistics, the vast majority, 99-point-something% of the casualties are Afghans on both sides: Taliban fighters, Afghan National Security Forces, and the innocent civilians stuck in the middle. So, there's never a wrong time to be trying to push a peace process. I think if you look at what the academics would normally regard as the key issues to do with ripeness of the conflict, I think we have the mutually hurting stalemate. It's quite clear, and statements from everybody are that there can be no military solution to this conflict. I'm glad to hear the same statements repeated by the two speakers just now. Even the Taliban Political Commission and others say there can be no military solution, there has to be a political solution. Unfortunately, there remain people, and I was told yesterday, even in Washington, but obviously not Lisa or Andrew, who still don't fully subscribe to this, and there are people on all sides who think that a war can be won, and there are also people who perhaps seek to spoil issues because they're making lots of money out of the current war, and that applies to both members of the Afghan government and also, or ex-members of the Afghan government, and also members of the Taliban, and both sides would also say that. So I think we are at the mutually hurting stalemate. Do the sides think they have the ability to get from the negotiating table, what they're fighting for? That is slightly more problematic, but I do think that President Ghani's open offer to the Taliban of anything you want to be can be on the table for the talks, including the question of the future presence of foreign troops, I think was a very generous, open and genuine offer, and so I think that should go some way to providing an element of reassurance to the Taliban that anything they want to discuss is up for discussion, and I think that's a very positive move by President Ghani, so I think that is a positive. More problematic perhaps is the third condition of strong united leadership on both sides of the conflict. President Ghani is slightly handicapped by the fact he faces re-election or elections in April-May 2019. Therefore, you can question why would anybody make a deal with the government under current circumstances. The answer is I think you need to start the discussions about making a deal, and then obviously these things do take a long time. Look at the example of Colombia and others. So it's not a reason not to start discussions about a peace process just because there may be a change in government. If you get the basic building blocks of a peace process right, it should not matter who is actually in government. Similarly, on the Taliban side, and maybe others will talk about this later, there is an issue as to how united the current Taliban leadership is under Haibatullah. There has been discussion of whether he needs another assembly of elders and senior Taliban leadership in order to firm him up in his leadership. That's been mooted and discussed. So I think that one is slightly more questionable, but again, it doesn't mean that people shouldn't be pushing for a peaceful solution. I think one thing on what would a peace deal look like, which John has asked us to sort of talk about, from the top-down approach, I think most Afghans would agree on the basic issues, which is that Afghanistan should be an Islamic country with a constitution. People can argue about exactly what that constitution should look like, and President Ghani's offer for peace included the idea of a constitutional review. that it should be secure within its own borders, that it was not going to be a threat to neighbors, to countries in the region, or even to the wider world, and that it is a unitary country, not ethnically or geographically divided up. Now, that doesn't exclude some element of, a more federal system if that's what people decide they want. So I think, if you like, there's a general agreement amongst all Afghans on that, whether they're, supporters of the Taliban or, supporters of the current government. And so the major problem, it seems to us in a number of ways, is actually getting the two sides into a room to talk about it, because there are, there will be a lot of things they can agree on in the broad brush sort of elements of it. In more detail, then, you have to go into the Constitution. We know that the Political Commission have in the past debated the current Afghan Constitution. Some of the pugwash conferences that have been held have also discussed the current Constitution, and there, the reasonable suggestion came from a couple of participants that, well, if the Taliban don't like 80% of the current Constitution, maybe we need to start from scratch. But if they only don't like 20 or 30%, then actually we should get the scholars in the room and we should just rewrite the articles they don't like. So I think that is not an issue. A role for the Taliban in local government, that is clearly something that in areas where they have a strong influence, they should get, whether through direct elections or how it works through local jirgas is another issue. The question of power sharing at the central level, whether they get ministries, deputy ministerships and such like in Kabul, is again something that will be up to an agreement to make. I think a much more interesting and difficult area, and this has been proven in other peace negotiations and peace deals, and hopefully is something that panelists in the second panel will discuss, is how you do the security sector reform that would have to come about. The Afghan National Defense and Security Forces are basically set up to counter the Taliban threat. So how you do, as they had to in Northern Ireland, they're going to have to in Colombia, how you change the nature of the Afghan National Security Forces to become more representative, to bring Taliban fighters and people into the security apparatus or into some form of local police, militias and something, is perhaps, I will leave to Erica and Kay Clark perhaps later on. I would just say that also the language of the discussion sometimes gets a bit confusing and a bit awkward. I mean, reintegration to us in the UN under our series of theories is really reintegration and reconciliation are both seen as events that happen after a top-level down peace deal. So reintegration is a case of reintegrating former fighters and such like back into society, into jobs, giving them alternative livelihoods and such like. It happened to a slight extent, the DDR progress in Afghanistan from 2002, 2003 onwards for a while, but that was dealing only with the Afghan militia forces, the old, for want of a better word, Northern Alliance forces, trying to give them a way of disarming and becoming, peaceful citizens working in different jobs. Reconciliation is normally seen as a longer-term process and involves issues to do with transitional justice or the South African-style Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and is people being accepted back into society and no fear of recrimination and such like. So I think some of the terminology, we need to be careful how we use it. In terms of lessons learned from the past, Lisa briefly mentioned the Afghan Peace and Reconciliation Program, $220 million, 11,000 fighters allegedly reintegrated, half of whom probably weren't originally fighters, some of whom only took 6 months off from the battlefield during a winter, had zero effect on the actual insurgency and levels of violence in the country. So I do think you need to look very carefully at this idea that you can buy off fighters, and also certainly one of the problems with APRP was NATO's involvement, ISAF as it was then, and the fact therefore that this was seen as a very hostile program designed to weaken the insurgency and was therefore heavily resisted by the Taliban because they saw it as a deliberate attempt to lure away, bribe and fracture their movement. And I think any peace initiative working from the bottom up has to be seen to be not involved with NATO, not seen as a NATO ploy, and NATO getting involved with it will be negative. Similarly, even the government getting overtly involved with it has to be very carefully handled. I wouldn't rule out peace initiatives at a lower level accommodations. We have seen in Helmand, Zabul, accommodations on health and education and such like between Taliban and government officials, and deals being struck, and those seem to work so long as they are not highlighted too heavily or the spotlight is turned upon them. We've had a temporary ceasefire before in Baghlan province where, again, it worked until too much attention was paid to it, and then the government suddenly decided that they didn't need the ceasefire anymore and went for it. So I think that the fact that you're after top-down on reconciliation doesn't mean that there is no chance of local accommodations, but what I would say is that bottom-up reconciliation is probably not going to lead to an overall peace deal. It is, as somebody else put it, would you rather deal with one bear or 1,000 snakes? Ideally, you're not dealing with either. If you deal with one bear and you can solve the whole problem, that also does not mean you're going to get peace across Afghanistan. Lots of these issues are, as Lisa has mentioned, quite local in nature. One size doesn't fit all. Even if you got the Quetta Shura to agree a peace deal, you would still need to do a lot of work at the local level. But I think that one of the things that concerns me about a bottom-up peace process is that, firstly, too often in the past it's been seen as money, as finance-based, and it's seen as rent-seeking opportunities have been many and taken advantage of distinctly. So I'm naturally cautious against a repeat of a program like that. Also, I see an absolute lack of official capacity at the local level in order to reintegrate people. It has not worked in the past. We also see that the Afghan National Security and Defence Force has been unable to give security guarantees. That is perhaps one area where NATO will be important to be helpful, is giving quiet, under-the-counter security guarantees. They won't strike on certain areas or certain individuals involved in coming across to the government. But I don't see that the government has been capable at the local level of doing things like creating jobs, providing security for people. The idea of peace zones, zones where there's a peace dividend, good governance, more support, more aid, more help for people who come to the peace process, is not a bad idea. But there's been plenty of places in the country which has been quite peaceful recently, and yet they still have failed to get good governance, aid, and proper development and jobs. So I'm not sure how well that was going to work. So that's just getting my retaliation in first against the second panelist. I'm afraid I won't be here for that. So maybe I'll just leave it on that note. I mean, I'm not optimistic in the short term about an overarching peace deal. These things take a long time, but the fact they take a long time, it's important to start, and that's what we've been saying to the Taliban in our official talks with the political commission. Is you are also saying there's no military solution, so let's start. Let's start talking. And also, we accept the fact you always say you want to talk to the Americans, fine, but also you do need to talk to the authorities in Kabul who control, dispute the percentage, a large percentage of the country and a large percentage of the resources of the country. So our message is still please get started informally, however you want to do it, but please start, because it's the Afghan people that are suffering. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very much, Steve. Perhaps we could go out to Kabul, to Mr. Amiri, and if you can't tell from your screen there, you're about 25 feet tall in this auditorium, just for your information.
Uh-oh.
Still muted, I think.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on this great panel. So, I mean, with regards to this is one of the most important discussions in Afghanistan for the last, let's say, 30 years or 40 years, since 1979, or especially since 1987. But let me give you a brief overview from the Taliban point of view. I mean, it's crystal clear to a lot of people what Taliban want when it comes to peace. The first is the withdrawal of international troops from Afghanistan. I think when they come to the peace negotiations, they would hold the ground when it comes to this point. Why? Because most of their recruitment and resources comes through this propaganda that the international troops are present in Afghanistan. The second one is recognition. One of the main things Taliban wants is actually recognition. They say when the Afghan government says, oh, let's talk to Pakistan and discuss it, to discuss bringing Taliban to peace. This actually further distance Taliban from the peace talk. Taliban will seek to literally lead any peace deal. Taliban, unlike 1998, the Geneva Accord, which was signed between the Pakistan and the Afghan government of that time, because I mean that is a precedent for the Taliban that they do not want to negotiate any peace deal through Pakistan or any third party. Besides recognition, Taliban also wants to remove from the sanction list, which is quite well known, and which is already mentioned many times. And another point of Taliban point of view that so far that we did research or work on the ground is a great emphasis on Afghanistan being an Islamic state. One of the main sources of Taliban legitimacy comes from the religious scholars. So I don't think that I think they would come with this very strongly, like a greater emphasis being an Islamic state. In fact, they want more the role of ulama in state affairs and policy, because I think I believe that even their negotiators would be mostly religious scholars when they come to any peace deal. The third is amendment to the current constitution. I think the Constitution does need some adjustment, irrespective of peace talks. So, I mean, that's a pretty, agreeable point between the Afghan government or the international community, Afghan government, and the Taliban. And many changes are already demanded, and Taliban's ideas can be negotiated and added. I think most of their demands, when they talk, I think they're already. I mean, most other Afghans also, I think, pretty much ask for the same changes. And the other point is that the release of prisoners when it comes to peace negotiations. They would come to, if there's any peace negotiations or peace talks, one of the main points would be release of prisoners. This is a very serious issue because there are thousands and thousands of Taliban in prisons. How would the question is that how the Afghan government and international community will come to some sort of mechanism for this. And another important point for the peace deal for the Taliban, which Taliban themselves are quite struggling with, is okay, if they discuss a peace deal with the Afghan government, the accommodation for the Taliban commanders and their soldier, what would be their role? What would be the role of their commanders? What would be the role of their foot soldiers? Would be basically replacing the police, basically these soldiers and commander becoming police and the Afghan National Army, and, would that be it? This is another key and important point. And then, so these are some of their general demands, but then coming to compromises. I mean, we always talk about, hypotheses, and we always talk what can happen. So here are some of the points that Taliban are pretty much willing to compromise on it. One of them is human rights. One of the main things that the international community especially worries is human rights. I think Taliban have come to that point and have realized, not just last year, but for the last 6-7 years. In fact, ever since they were overthrown from power in 2001, that one of the main area that they have to compromise, and which I think they're willing to compromise, is the human rights, which includes, from human rights, I think from my point of view, also include women's rights and minority rights. If you look to all their statements from 1994, from their regime time up to 2018, I think there's a clear signal that they want to, for example, have minority and rights respected, and also women's rights. Another key, with regards to Taliban, one of the main problems with the Taliban is they lack capacity to handle issues, especially technical issues like human rights. I mean, they do talk about these things, but honestly, some of them hardly, literally, when you break it to them down, they're like, oh, they have that issue there. Another, does Taliban willing to compromise? I think, like I said, yes, they do. I think they do realize that the importance of engaging international community. Engagement with the international does require to take a big step towards human rights, especially from women's rights into girls' education. So that brings me to another point, is education, especially girls' education. I think Taliban, when it comes to peace talks, when they come to tables and the international community want things, that the international community will say, okay, girls' education. I think they are pretty much there to compromise girl education. They already, to some extent, in some provinces, are willing to allow girl education. The other is media. Media is a big discussion. I think to some extent they will be fine, but I don't think immediately they would allow, because they still have some reservation, because most of their support comes from conservative societies, which supports them. And, you know, if they just automatically agree to some of like the TV stations and things, that would literally, they would lose a lot of constituency. And another important is their foreign policy. One thing that Taliban has realized from the last 18 years is their foreign policy. They do realize that lack of engagement from 1994 to 2001 with the international community was one of the reasons that they paid the big price, losing the whole territory and government, and coming to the current situation. And, having said, so one other things, what would Taliban not seek? A lot of people think that Taliban are power hungry, and I don't think Taliban would they would seek power sharing on the district level, provincial level, national level. Like, for example, power sharing from my point of view is like, for example, like Hezbollah kind of like, I have my own territory. I would not allow the central government. I don't think that, we have so far the research that we have done, we haven't come across such thing that, that they are gonna ask to control certain areas. If there is a peace deal, it would be a very comprehensive peace deal. They would come in and they would take part in this government, but they would not be like literally power sharing boundaries, that kind of power sharing. And then the other thing is, I don't think Taliban will ask for solo monopoly. This is like the Taliban would not seek that. And then, and the other important thing is that one of the panelists talked about is reconciliation. I don't think Taliban would seek reconciliation. In fact, they hate such terms. So, the word reconciliation, integration, and, no, they say, well, we were fighting you, now we're coming back, we will, just let's make a government, and then they will play as, the political elites will play a side role. And now, I'm going to talk about challenges. One of the main challenges for the peace talk, for the upcoming peace talk, especially for the substance, is that the commanders, as you know, Taliban is an umbrella of commanders, basically, an umbrella of mahas, fronts. So in 1994 to 2001, when you read their history, when they were negotiating with the Northern Alliance, one of their main problem was that the political elite would come up with one idea, the commanders would come with another idea. So this would be a big challenge for the Taliban themselves. A big portion of these commanders are low-level, middle-level commanders who are mostly field commanders, play an important role. They will have to be convinced to follow the line with peace agreement and need to be offered incentive by the Taliban. Incentive by the Taliban, not by the international community. Yes, the international community can work with the process. And then if we talk about positive changes in so far in Taliban, is one of the positive changes for peace. I'm not saying just for peace, is that Taliban from 2014 and 2015, they brought this very interesting change into their structure. The change in Taliban structure, before the structure of the fighters were more guerrilla type. Now the Taliban has more farmer structure, which resemble more like an army structure. So because the guerrilla type, it's very hard to go after each one, to literally talk. These changes have started from 2014, especially when Mansour took over, he brought this. So this is actually a positive change for the general peace dialogue, because at least there is much more line of order if right now to some extent in the Taliban lines. So I think this is all from my side. I think overall there are some good points or good that the government, the Afghan government and international community can build on to bring Taliban to peace. And I think Taliban do realize that they have to compromise on some of the things which in the past they did not think were important. Thank you.
They don't have microphones by their hands, but they're all clapping for you. Thank you, Mr. Mary. Could we go to Laurel?
Thanks, Johnny. I'm going to focus on the U.S. role in catalyzing and sustaining a peace process. And first, a brief comment on the relationship between the top-down negotiation of a peace agreement with the Taliban as an organization and bottom-up peace building in local communities. And I'm using that term very purposefully, bottom-up peace building in local communities, which is the way that the organizers of this event framed the concept of bottom up. And I think it's very good to frame it and think of it in that way, because there does appear to be some confusion, at least in Washington, about what bottom up means and a variety of versions of what bottom up means or realistically could mean. I'd like to subscribe wholeheartedly to all of Steve's comments about reintegration efforts and the concerns that he flagged and the nomenclature concerns that he raised, I think, are not merely a technical point, but they do speak to some conceptual confusion about what we're talking about here. As framed as community-level peace building, I think there could well be complementarity between the two approaches to peacemaking. And certainly, when it comes to the implementation phase of any top-down peace deal, if there is such a deal, then community-level peace building is going to be needed to achieve anything like enduring stability. I don't know anyone who thinks that a top-down peace deal, even those who are most committed to that idea conceptually, I don't know anyone who thinks that that's going to end all violence and create peace throughout Afghanistan. It's part of, in my view, what is needed and a critical part, but that community level peace building is going to be crucial as well. That's not the same thing as reintegration. One of the challenges in formalized top-down peacemaking will be how to create space for that ground level peace building to occur in an organic fashion. Top-down peacemaking is not organic, but it's something that occurs at the community level, if it's going to really take hold, is going to have to be more organic. It's very difficult, in my view, to see community-level peace building as being the main vector for significant reductions in violence and an end to the insurgency as such. There are multiple reasons for that, some of which Steve's comments allude to, which is that depending on how you conceive of that effort, it could actually provoke some counter reactions. But I'll focus on one reason why I don't see the ground level peacemaking as being the main vector, and that is that the United States is one of the protagonists in the war, and it has to be one of the protagonists in peacemaking if there's actually going to be any peacemaking. There is little, if any, realistic role for the United States government in bottom-up efforts or ground-level community-based peacebuilding. Those kinds of efforts, in order to be truly organic and take hold and be meaningful, well and truly have to be Afghan. The U.S. is not and cannot be a meaningful player at the community level in Afghanistan, even if there might be some ways to support and encourage efforts at that level. This brings me to my second point. I think it's important to consider the ways in which process and substance are linked in efforts to push forward peacemaking in general, but specifically in this case. And this particularly applies to the U.S. role in peacemaking in Afghanistan. Until the United States government fully grapples with and answers the very difficult questions of what it envisions as the end result of a peace process and what it is willing to put on the table, at least as matters for negotiation, American claims of support for a negotiated settlement are not likely to be viewed as credible enough to get a process going. To be even more blunt about it, the United States invaded Afghanistan, it overthrew the Taliban, it played a considerable part in deciding who was going to be included in and who was going to be excluded from politics in Afghanistan. It pays the lion's share of the costs of Afghan security forces, and it's kept troops in the country for going on 17 years. In light of those circumstances, to claim that ending the war predominantly requires Afghans talking to Afghans while remaining silent about the question whether the U.S. is prepared to negotiate the terms of a phase-out of its military activities in the country flies in the face of the reality that a crucial element of the conflict dynamics is the American military role in Afghanistan. If the U.S. is prepared to put on the table the topic of its military presence in Afghanistan as a matter for negotiation, then it's long past the time for being coy about that. Being clear on this substantive point will be needed if the U.S. is genuinely committed to catalyzing a peace process. And I do believe that the United States needs to be a catalyst in this process. President Ghani's outreach to the Taliban at the Kabul conference in February and subsequent steps has certainly been positive. But the mistrust of and the lack of clarity about U.S. intentions with regard to peacemaking on the part of the Taliban and also on the part of countries in the region is such that it's hard to see a process gaining momentum without a much more assertive U.S. role. A more assertive U.S. role would entail, as I said, being clearer about the substantive issues that the U.S. envisions being negotiable and that it's prepared to negotiate. It also entails making, at the highest level, political backing for the initiative more evident than it currently is. If and when a negotiation takes off, I could imagine there being issues for negotiation that are separated into those that are primarily for resolution among Afghans. For instance, some of the constitutional questions that other speakers have mentioned. And then, on the other hand, issues that implicate U.S. commitments. But let's be realistic. After all the blood and treasure the U.S. has poured into Afghanistan, and I have to say, knowing how the U.S. government works, if a peace negotiation gets that far so that these issues are really being negotiated, the U.S. is not likely to self-limit its role in shaping the substance of an agreement. Afghans should prepare for that reality, and the United States should prepare for that reality too. It's not apparent to me that any of the sides yet, and that includes the Taliban as well, have yet readied themselves to delve into the substance of peacemaking. I do believe that at this stage, doing that, really getting into the substance, at least privately on each side, could give a boost to the process. And on the part of the U.S., more publicly being clear about what it's prepared to negotiate could give a very significant boost to the process. A final point, I would note that the need to negotiate the American military role in Afghanistan as part of a peace process is not only a challenge, it's also an opportunity. Careful crafting of the terms for phasing and benchmarking of a change in the U.S. military role could provide very important leverage over implementation of an agreement. That leverage would be valuable not only for the United States in ensuring that its security interests are protected, but it would also be valuable for Afghans who will very rightly, I think, be concerned about the uncertainties of implementation of any deal.
Thank you, Laurel. This panel is crushing it. Barney, could we go to you?
Thank you very much. I'm sorry Lisa just walked out, because I was going to say that one reason for optimism is that we opened the session with a speech by Lisa Curtis, who works for John Bolton, and she gave a talk that was much more forward-leaning on the peace process than anything that Hillary Clinton and Richard Holbrooke would have allowed me to say 8 years ago. So it shows that something structural has changed. And also that, of course, President Ghani's initiative today is extremely welcome. Anything that has the potential to lessen the bloodshed is welcome. It's in the spirit of the Helmand Peace March and I'm sure, of the Afghan people. But I'm going to talk about some more basic problems that cannot be addressed at that kind of political level. Because, in my view, the war is not the result of a dispute between the Afghan government and the Taliban. And it cannot be resolved by negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban. In fact, war has been going on in Afghanistan since 1978. And every time, and it's been over a variety of issues. And every time those issues are resolved, the war continues on a different basis. First, it was against the imposition of communism and the Soviet invasion. Soviet troops left, communist government fell, the war continued on a different basis. Then it was about the division of the country. Taliban came, almost unified the country by force, but it just led to a continuation of war on a different basis. Then the United States came, created the security situation in which it was possible to build the current government with the help of the international community. But it didn't create peace, it just led to war again on a different basis. Now, therefore we should think, why is this happen over and over again? Here's my explanation. The Afghanistan that we have today is not a natural phenomenon. The word Afghanistan has meant many different things. This particular territory that we now call Afghanistan, which was demarcated by the British and Russian empires, was demarcated to be a weak state that could not support itself, that would play a certain role in international security. It was part of a security architecture of the late 19th century, in which a buffer state supported by Britain would create a separation between the British and Russian empires, which were in a rough balance of power militarily. And I'm going to give a kind of realist, in the international relations sense, explanation of this. Now, that security architecture eroded in many ways over time. There was the Bolshevik Revolution, the independence and partition of India, and so on. The environment changed. For a while, Afghanistan was stable by a kind of agreement as a sovereign state, but with balanced aid coming from the two main forces in the international community, the US alliance system, including Pakistan, and the Soviet-led alliance system. And that was based on certain rules of the game. Those rules broke down in 1978, and it has never been, and they have not been, no new rules have been reestablished. It's much more complex because dealing with Pakistan and India is different from dealing with just India or the British Empire in India. Dealing with revolutionary Iran is different from dealing with an Iran that is divided into British and Russian spheres of influence. Dealing with a former Soviet Union, former Russian Empire that consists of multiple independent states plus Russia is different from dealing with Tsarist Russia. Dealing with a China and an India, which are some of the fastest growing economies in the world and the largest economies in the world, and which are investing rapidly in infrastructure all over that region, is very different not only from the 19th century, it's different from what it was like in 1989. When China and India were still both very inward-looking. Now, so the problem that is actually presented to us is, what is the security architecture and the architecture of the relationship between Afghanistan and the rest of the international system that will make it possible for Afghans to have peace, that will support a state that will not provoke, that will not threaten the neighbors in such a way that they try to destabilize it. Now, let's look what's on the table right now. We talk about Pakistan supporting the Taliban, providing them with resources as being a source of destabilization. Well, that is true, but it's not only the Taliban who are supported by foreign powers in Afghanistan, it is also the government. So what we are putting on the table as our position is an Afghan government which is paid for by the United States, and Afghan security forces which are paid for by the United States, backed up by the US, in support of a US-defined counterterrorism agenda, in the middle of Central and South Asia. Now, that is a proposal for a security architecture which only works if all the other countries in the region accept it, because they can subvert it if they consider it to be a threat to them. And they do consider it to be a threat to them. So, therefore, the Taliban are under very weak pressure to come to some kind of an agreement, because they have diplomatic relations of a sort with Russia, with Iran, of course, with Pakistan, with more than diplomatic, with China, and so on. And while none of those countries want the Taliban to take power, or for al-Qaeda to take back, they also, for them, stabilizing Afghanistan as it exists now is stabilizing an American military base in the heart of their region. And that they see as a threat to them just as much as, it's not more than the threat of al-Qaeda and ISIS. So therefore, the basis for some future stability and peacemaking in Afghanistan has to be an internationally accepted framework for providing financial and economic support to the Afghan state, for it to have adequate security forces, and those security forces will be less if there is a non-threatening environment. So there has to be a kind of understanding of the countries around Afghanistan, which means, at a minimum, India, Pakistan, Iran, Russia, and China, Central Asia coming in as well, with the United States, about what the dispensation is be there so that they don't feel threatened by it. Now, that would address the more underlying problem, which means what is the role of the United States? And that puts the question of the American troops in a different perspective, I think. Because it's not just that some Afghans, Taliban and others, want the troops to leave, and other Afghans want the troops to stay because of what they stand for, and because we want them there for counterterrorism reasons. It's that we want the region to take ownership of the peace process. Well, in a sense, they have, by showing that they don't support a peace process that leads to an American-dominated region, as they see it. So, I think the most important thing the United States could do for a peace process, one, dealing with Afghanistan itself, is offer to discuss the troop presence with the Taliban and the Afghans, and that means putting the bilateral security agreement probably on the table as well, which is one of the Taliban's demands. But more than that, and more important, is discussing it with the other countries in the region. And unfortunately, at the moment, our relations, well, I won't go into it in any detail, I don't need to, but the relationship that the United States has with Pakistan, Iran, Russia, and China are not conducive to having that kind of environment. So even though we are talking about a peace process in Afghanistan, I'm afraid that the rest of our foreign policy at the moment makes that almost impossible. I say almost because I never want to give up hope, and there are some things that we can do. And I'll just say that there is nonetheless, I'm not being negative, there's a very positive dynamic precisely because of the tremendous investments in infrastructure that are taking place by China, India, Russia, and Iran. For instance, in the last few months, President Xi Jinping of China and Prime Minister Modi of India met in Wuhan, China, and they reached agreement on, among other things, how China and India might, on the principle, not on how, but of China and India cooperation in Afghanistan, including cooperation, the Chinese tell me, on building some infrastructure leaking Central Asia through Afghanistan to Iran. Foreign Minister Zarif of Iran has been to India, and they are working on how to get around the fact that the U.S. has pulled out of the JCPOA and may impose new sanctions in order to keep the connectivity of Afghanistan to India through Iran open. Prime Minister Modi met with President Putin as well, and they talked about a north-south corridor and how and cooperation on Afghanistan. So these building blocks are there, and in the future, if Afghanistan does become stabilized, it will be stabilized not as a separator, as it was in the 19th century, but as a connector, as what the Afghans call a roundabout of these connectivity projects. But for the U.S. to play a positive role, it has to engage positively with these connectivity projects and see a positive-sum game in the growth of that region, not just see it as a threat of rising powers, and see that as the main long-term, and see the building of stronger states and stronger economies in that region as the main bulwark against terrorism, rather than drones and a small military presence that creates more opposition.
Thank you very much to Barney and all our panelists. I'm fiercely resolved to keep this panel on time in preparation for the next one, but maybe I will ask a first few questions to follow up on what you've all said and then turn things over to the audience. Maybe a first question is on the issue of the U.S. troops and or their role in a peace process. So virtually every stakeholder has some view on where this issue has to land in the context of a peace deal. The region, maybe we could broadly summarize, sees a U.S. presence as acceptable in the short term in the interest of stability, but at least potentially a long-term threat. The Taliban demand this timetable of some kind at an early stage in negotiations. The U.S. has refused to grant that to date and probably is not going to grant something along the lines that the Taliban are demanding. But you can't help but notice some flexibility in the statements that each side puts forward. The U.S. will say things like, we won't necessarily need troops if the country is peaceful and there's no terrorism threat. The Taliban once made a complete withdrawal the precondition to any sort of discussions, and now will say things like, give us a multi-year window that may or may not end in a total withdrawal. So the question, I'd be interested in anyone here's take, maybe we could start with Laurel, is there a potential compromise between these two positions that's at least imaginable? And can you imagine a sequence of near-term steps to kind of start that discussion?
I think it's imaginable, but it will have to be tested vigorously in the course of a negotiation. I think the most important near-term step is for the United States to clarify whether it even sees the issue, the topic, as a matter for negotiation. And I don't see any reason why any of the other parties at the moment would believe that the United States has made it evident that it sees that as a topic for negotiation. Doesn't mean that it has to be negotiated up front, but to send that signal very clearly, I think, would be quite helpful. But beyond that, whether you could end up with a compromise requires, I think, a lot more work at least on the American side, if not on the others, in determining what its actual position is. And I'm not certain that the United States, or I'm fairly certain the United States has not reached a point of clarity about what its actual position is on this issue. Certainly, and Barney may want to comment on this, I don't think that it's evident to the other countries in the region that the United States has reached a point of clarity.
Well, first, even before talking about negotiations, I think there's a question of, can we reach an agreement as a matter of principle that one of our goals is Afghanistan without foreign troops? At a Track 2 meeting in Chantilly, France, a few years ago, maybe more than a few years ago by now, the Taliban said that troops have to leave now, and the other Afghans say, no, we need them now. But they reached agreement on the principle that the goal was an Afghanistan without foreign troops. Recently, I asked a U.S. official, if the Afghan government and the Taliban came to complete agreement on a political settlement, would the U.S. be willing to withdraw its troops? And the official said, we don't know. And the reason for that is there's a legitimate reason for that. The reason for that is the troops are there because we were attacked by Al-Qaeda, not because of civil dispute in Afghanistan. So the troop presence depends on a political settlement, but it also depends on adequate counter-terrorist measures being in place. So those counter-terrorist measures also have to be part of any negotiation. And of course, since we're the ones who have to be satisfied with them, we have to be part of that negotiation.
I would just say that the Taliban have said to us that they don't rule out a future presence of foreign troops. However, it would have to be renegotiated by the new legitimate government, which presumably is the one they have played a part in forming.
Rahmatullah, would you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I would like to add a few points on this. I mean, one thing when you refer to the Al-Qaeda, there's a clear indication in the line of Taliban that they would not be willing to more take any responsibility for these foreign fighters. I think this should be part of the peace deal. Any peace negotiation, anything that comes forward, it has to, these foreign troops, because right now there are hundreds of them right now inside Afghanistan. This has to be, because this is considered a big threat to the United States and other countries. So I think that can play a potential key role in this peace deal. That's it.
I mean, maybe that segues to a closely related terrorism question. I mean, presumably the United States needs to see more from the Taliban than simply a verbal renunciation of terrorist groups for an agreement to stick. So I'd be interested in any of the panelists' discussion on what does it mean or what should it mean for the Taliban to cut ties with international terrorist groups, in specific, and is there a way to maintain a counterterrorism presence that sort of ensures that safety from terrorism that is acceptable to insurgent groups entering a peace agreement, or for that matter, to the region that is concerned about what else any presence might be used for?
Well, I see David Sedney there, so he knows very well that in 2011 we actually sent the Taliban a note describing what that meant. And that if they had not broken off talks with us, we would have proceeded to discuss it further. But I would say the most important thing would be to clarify, that if they join a political settlement, there would be unity of the national security forces, that they would support those national security forces, the international community would support those national security forces, and there wouldn't be any safe areas in Afghanistan where those terrorist groups could organize, which is why, by the way, that any idea of a peace agreement based on giving certain regions of the country to the Taliban or something like that is a complete non-starter, because not only is it against Afghan national principles, it is also against our counterterrorism interests. But from our side, again, though, I think we have to recognize eventually, the U.S. counterterrorism policy cannot be that we will continually forever kill terrorists in every country wherever they are. We eventually have to form partnerships with governments in those countries. So what we would be looking for, and realize that we're not going to have 100% guarantee against it. And the more efficient way is to strengthen our homeland defenses. So I think we reach an understanding on unity of the security forces, unity of power, on cooperation against certain groups. And then we keep watching, and just as we would with any other country, we wouldn't need to have our own troops there necessarily forever in order to be satisfied that our basic counterterrorism needs were met.
I'll add something
I'll
if
fire
you
off.
want.
Go ahead.
I mean, look, I think you get the most definitive rhetorical commitment that you can in writing and signed, like with any peace agreement, and then you seek to enforce it. I mean, a lot is going to lie more generally in the implementation measures, and this is why I said the troop negotiating the American military presence and some kind of phased modification of that is an opportunity for implementation, because presumably some of the benchmarks would relate to observable steps taken to break any financial or material ties with other groups. I mean, ideally, you would get to the point where you can work with common purpose and collaboration against terrorist groups that would remain in the region, and the greatest opportunity for that could be against ISKP. And perhaps you could even bake into a peace agreement some kind of invitation to the United States or to NATO to cooperate with the newly reconstituted Afghan government in that endeavor.
Maybe I'll ask one more, and then I'll turn it over. And you all have admirably fulfilled my wish for discussions about, what the settlement might look like, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. So this is a more way forward, near-term question, and it's that there's a very long-standing impasse that I would consider the primary impediment to a serious process breaking out, which is that the Taliban want to talk to the U.S. and not to their government, or not to the Afghan government. Everyone else wants them to talk to Kabul. So are there creative ways to get around this impasse that maybe haven't been given full consideration? Sometimes we hear about a third-party mediator. Sometimes we hear about a track 2 process that can explore things informally. Perhaps the answer is, if you're in your U.S. policy or Afghan policymaker hat, to just wait the Taliban out on this question. What's the way to handle this impasse, maybe?
Well, if we want creativity, we should ask the audience, I think.
We can do that too.
The more minds that think about it, the better. I mean, various things have been tried. Clearly, the Afghan government does not like track 2 and hasn't done for some time, ever since President Karzai threw his teddy out of the pram after the Chantilly process, and objected to track 2s because they see track 2s as a way of the Taliban refusing to engage in track 1. I don't necessarily believe that's entirely true. I think there's utility in some track 2s, some track 1.5s. Third-party mediation has been suggested, tried to some extent, and still not been accepted, because, as you say, the ultimate thing is it comes down to recognition and legitimacy of the Islamic Emirate, as they would see it, and how to engage in a process that acknowledges them as a very important part of any solution, but without recognizing them as the Islamic Emirate. People have suggested just turning up, no nameplates, no even name cards, various suggestions, but so far there hasn't been a willingness to engage, by the Taliban with the Afghan government, whereas, as you say, everyone else believes that all parties to the conflict, including the Americans, need to be in the room to ensure there is no repeat of Bonn, where a major part of the potential conflict was excluded. So, all bright ideas welcome, I would say, when it comes to this.
I think all three sides are so dug in on this issue that simply waiting is unproductive and not likely to produce any change. And so, in my view, introducing a new factor into this could be a way out of that box. And I don't personally believe that third-party facilitation or mediation has been seriously tried, and I think introducing that could shake up this very static situation by introducing a new dynamic into it. Moreover, you have to consider why is it that each side is so dug in on their positions on this. It's not just a question of what's the shape of the table and what's the format. It's because it's a process issue that relates to substantive positions. And it's because the Taliban wants to reinforce its position that it is a legitimate negotiating party and reinforce its position that the real power is the United States and that the Afghan government is simply a puppet. The United States and the Afghan government are dug in on their position because they want to reinforce their view that the Afghan government is sovereign and that the United States is not a puppet master of Afghanistan. And so, one reason why having a neutral facilitator of a process could be helpful is because that is a person or institution who could deal with the parties in a sort of proximity talk format where you are dealing with them in an even-handed way that could potentially, none of this has high probability of working, but potentially could create a face-saving opportunity for each of the parties so that they are not having to be seen as compromising on these substantive positions that they're trying to reinforce.
Well, it's basically, I think, though, it comes down to the joke about how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is only one, but the light bulb really has to want to change.
And you'll leave it there.
Problem solved. Reference, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I would like to add a point on this one, is that the question that always is asked when you go to communities and, talk to these people, this is, well, how would we discuss, how we would negotiate with the government, which is challenged daily by its own people? So the problem is here is that the Taliban are, one of the reasons is that Taliban are now coming to negotiation is that the Afghan government is on daily basis challenged by the warlords in Kabul city and the provinces, And so, this gives the that if it cannot control the people within its own controlled territory, how can we can negotiate with such thing? The second is that, as some of the panelists talked about, is that the money comes from the international community. So most of the police are loyal to warlords. We have the example. So this actually further distance Taliban from coming to a negotiating table with the Afghan government. Well, is there any alternative way? I think there is a coordination. First is lack of coordination between international community and the Afghan government. And the other problem is that the current situation environment in Kabul, like, for example, all the embassies, all the international donors, they're literally dictating everything to the Afghan government, and it's open secret. But the third thing is we don't have any national interest, the definition of national interest. So these are some of the challenges that actually further put the Afghan government on weaker position when it comes to negotiations. So I think it's if there's proper coordinations, if the government takes the lead. The most important thing here, I believe, is that the Afghan government doesn't take the lead when it comes to many of the peace activities in Afghanistan. That's it.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm very happy to turn it over to questions from the audience now. Maybe in the interest of getting as many people as we possibly can, I will take 3 at a time, and then we can handle these as we see fit. Maybe we could go with you, sir, and David, and in the middle.
Thank you. Kamran Bukhari, Center for Global Policy. This is a question for everybody, but I would love to hear Rahmatullah's views and Barney's views. So it seems like we have two extreme positions. One is the Taliban goal of an envisioned polity that, for lack of a better term, can be called an Islamic State. On the other hand, the Afghan government and the international community would want to absorb the Taliban into the current state with some modifications. It doesn't seem like anybody's going to get their ideal position. So is there a middle ground where the state can be rejiggered to have a power sharing mechanism? I know Rahmatullah said that they don't want a power sharing mechanism, but I'm just trying to understand this issue better. Thank you.
And then could you pass the mic right next to you to David Sedney here? And then if we have a second mic, it would go over here.
Thank you very much, David Sedney, Senior Associate with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'd like to second your kudos, Johnny, to Rahmatullah Ameri. Nobody in this audience can understand the suffering that he has undergone, and the fact that he is a voice for peace after what has happened to him is an amazing testament to the human spirit. So I want to thank you for that. And my question is for you, Mr. Rahmatullah Ameri. Given all the difficulties everybody has laid out, what do you think are the prospects for President Ghani's announced ceasefire today? Do you think the Taliban will respond? And if they do respond, how do you think they might respond? I see that the Taliban spokesman has announced that he has to consult with senior leaders, so it shows that there's at least some discussion there. Thank you.
Yeah, hello, Phil Schrafer. I live in the neighborhood and I enjoy the coffee. I go to a lot of these meetings, and first of all, I wanted to give kudos to USIIP. It's incredible how you show the Afghan side of the story, having Amiri here Skype. You've had many surveys. You point out there are warlords and so kudos to you. Going to some of the other organizations in town, I found out that there's an extremely conservative, military-oriented perspective, which sees that if we don't keep our army in there, all of these people are going to do an al-Qaeda attack on us. They lump the Taliban in with al-Qaeda, with ISIS, and so on. So I really don't see our country playing a very good role. I agree with Mr. Rubin that you've got to have India, China, Iran, all these countries got to make the move and sort of budge us out of the picture. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I guess two people directed their comments squarely to Kabul, so maybe we could start with you, Rahmatullah, and then anyone next to me can take whatever piece they like.
Thank you so much. First, it's glad to see Dr. David Sedney. I mean, he's an inspiration to me. He's, I mean, when I was injured at the American University of Afghanistan, he was the one who helped me a lot, and I've learned so much from him. Thank you, sir, and glad to see you. And with regards to the questions about the power sharing, the thing is that the Taliban, when I say that Taliban does not want power sharing, I meant that they do not want to have control certain areas, but they do want to take part in the government. They do want to play a role in the government. But how that would be, the Taliban has not come up with the planning, or they still do not have the idea how they would want to continue if there is some sort of power sharing, how that would look like. For example, Musakala, Northern Helmand, for example, let's say, or Helmand as a whole, where they are the strong. Okay, they will control Helmand, but they would not want okay, this is our territory, we would not want the government. No, I think they would want the government to play a role. They would respect the central government if there's a peace deal, if there's a government, as one of the panelists says, that yes, they would negotiate, they would come to after a new government, after the government that they take part in it. So that's with regards to the power sharing. With regards to Dr. David Sedney questions, I think Taliban are pretty much under pressure because this is the second biggest announcement of this year that President Ghani has come up with the courage to take. I mean, the President Ghani has asked him open negotiation without any conditions, and secondly, he now comes up for a ceasefire. Why is this important? Because we have precedents. For example, for Gulbuddin Hikmatyar today, one of the main critiques of Gulbuddin is Dr. Najib offered him many peace deals, but he didn't take it. And he now realized that many actors were behind that he was not able to take that. So Taliban has a good precedent to look and take advantage of these peace deals. Now the question is whether they will take advantage, whether they will take and come up with a. I think it's a matter of. I mean, it's a broader issue because Afghanistan is contextual. Each area has its own social dynamics. It needs a variety engagement. For example, in northern Afghanistan, Taliban has one kind of system. In South Afghanistan, Taliban has another kind of system. In southeast, where Paktia Khos is, the Taliban has another kind of system. The Haqqani network is there. You know, Haqqani network is in the U.S. list, you know, terrorist list. How would that play? You know, like it's a big, I think it needs some time for the Taliban to come up. But I do think that they are pretty much under pressure. That's it from us.
Anyone?
Just very quickly, you could think, for example, that the Taliban, following the Iranian model, might like to see themselves having some sort of guardianship council to make sure that everything's in line with, you know, Sharia and Islamic law. I'm not recommending that. I'm just saying it's a possibility.
Look, unfortunately, I will have to run out of here after I make it. But briefly, first of all, we don't know if after the attempt to hold elections in 2019, there will still be a functioning constitutional order in Afghanistan, which is something that should put a lot of pressure on us to get a peace settlement. Second, there's not going to be formal power sharing with the Taliban. But you can have informal power sharing. For instance, today in Afghanistan, you might say there's informal power sharing with Jamiat because they have certain governorships and so on. But there's no formal agreement. There could be something like that with the Taliban as well. The most difficult issue will be the most difficult issue inside Afghanistan will be the same most difficult issue about the international region, which is who controls the guns. Because you know, the Taliban won't want to rely for their security on security forces that they think are organized and led by their enemies, and vice versa. Those who spent their lives resisting the Taliban are not going to be happy with armed Taliban possibly being in the security forces in areas where they live. So there will have to be some agreement about that. And I would predict that if we ever, God help us, get to that stage, that will be the most difficult issue.
Can I just add one thing on the ceasefire? I think everyone who has an interest in Afghanistan matters would hope that this would have an effect, but I think it's important to recognize that ceasefires generally are fragile and are vulnerable to spoiling. They create an opportunity for spoilers. And a ceasefire that was not negotiated but was declared by one side is perhaps especially creates an opportunity for spoilers. And so I think it will be important to not read too much, too definitively into what happens over the coming days with the ceasefire.
Thank you very much. I know there are other questions. With my profound apologies, I'm going to cut it off here because multiple panelists have to fan across the earth within the hour. So before we break, we're going to do about a 15-minute coffee break. We'll come back at, let's say, 3:20. And an important warning is that we do not allow food or drink in this auditorium. Look at the lovely carpet underneath you. It would not look as nice if we did. So we'll see you then. Thank you so much to our panelists.
Thank you. Nice to see you. I'll be in touch.
Great.
That was a disaster.
Down the steps here.
those little people that important people have to remind of their.
Welcome back, everyone. We're ready to begin the second panel. My name is Scott Worden. I am the Director of Afghanistan and Central Asia Programs here at the U.S. Institute of Peace. As you heard at the beginning of the session, the idea of this event is to look at the peace process from two angles. We've just heard about top-down approaches, the diplomatic, the international, the regional. And this panel really will focus on the bottom-up, or what is happening outside of the capital, what is happening in the provinces, what is happening among communities. All of our researchers, and I'll give a brief introduction, all of our speakers have an extensive background researching, living in, being, talking to Afghans, and particularly outside of the capital. So this is a contrast and a different perspective from the views that were presented in the first panel. You have bios available outside, so I just want to give a brief introduction. We'll hear from the panelists. I'll ask a few questions similar to the format of the first panel, and then open it up to the audience. And then, as mentioned, the Afghan ambassador to the U.S. is en route, and so unless there is a flight delay, then he will be delivering closing remarks. I'll introduce in the order that the speakers will be talking. First on my far left is Michael Semple. He is a professor at Queen's University in Belfast, doing research at the Institute for the Study of Conflict Transformation and Social Justice. He has practiced and written on humanitarian assistance and conflict resolution in Afghanistan and the region for decades. He has held official positions as the special advisor or an advisor to the special representative of the European Union and the deputy of that office, as an official of the UN, and also as an NGO worker and a humanitarian worker over years in Afghanistan. We will hear next from Erica Gaston, to my immediate left. She is a non-resident fellow with the Global Public Policy Institute, GPPI, in Berlin. She's also a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge. Before joining GPPI and embarking on her academic studies, she is also an alum of USIP. She worked here as a senior program officer on rule of law issues in Afghanistan and Yemen. And she also founded the Regional Policy Initiative at the Open Society Institute. To my right is Kate Clark. She is director of the Afghan Analyst Network. Her involvement in Afghanistan goes back to 1999 when she was a correspondent for the BBC there. She has covered the wars over time from many angles. And she is also a frequent author and commentator, including on the AN website, which is one of the great resources that we have on information about Afghanistan. And then last, but far from not least, Niloufar Saki. She is a lecturer at George Mason University. She is the founder and former executive director of Women Activities and Social Services Association, or WASA, which she founded in Herat in 2002. She was also former country director of the Open Society of Afghanistan, a branch of the Open Society Institute, and has had many civil society leadership positions. So without further ado, let me turn over to Michael and hear from your views.
Thanks, Scott. I'm really delighted to see a good crowd today. I hope we have a crowd on the internet as well. It's great that you're here. I think it's a positive sign that people are taking an interest in Afghanistan after this stage of the war has dragged on for so many years. It still counts, it still matters. It can still go right or wrong. And I'm sure that your interest will make a difference. I'm confident that with the best efforts of some of the people who are working for a positive outcome in Afghanistan, it'll come right. That Afghans who desire a peaceful and normal future, that they'll get it, and that there'll be a day, perhaps not so long, where USIP almost has a department of lessons from the Afghan peace process. That you'll have a fair share of well-qualified Afghans, like jet-setting around the world and hosting visits to Afghanistan, explaining how they got where they got to. This is possible, and the doubters will be, well, say, happily dismayed. I reached this stage of optimism partly by the highly effective and committed Afghans who I have a privilege to interact with, who are well steeped in and confident in their culture and heritage, but also well used to playing their part in the world. I certainly would think of Karim Khalili, the current head of the High Peace Council in Afghanistan, who I've seen do amazing things over the years. As an officer of the United Nations, I've had a chance to be with him in the mountains and talk practical human rights and how to overcome abuses in very nasty stages of war. And now I see him sitting at the top of a High Peace Council, working long hours every day to help bring this war to an end, confident that he will succeed. I think even of some of the people who've been through Guantanamo, who all the sort of stuff you get in the press about how somehow that you lock people up and that they end up with dreadful grievances. I actually see the contrary story, that that men who've been involved in war, seen many of their comrades killed, and in fact got a chance even to know some people from the US and come away more reflective and more committed to seeing an end to this war. And I know that some of them are working to achieve that end. I know brave people of the Afghan security forces, manning isolated security posts with difficult logistics, coming under attack, motivating their men, fighting the war because the war is still going on, and waiting for those who are doing the politics to help bring it to an end. I'm sure that all those people who are working for a peaceful end to this conflict will prevail. Of those who are involved, they are a strong majority. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes on this issue of bottom-up versus top-down. Now, I actually could have sat on either panel, because guess what? The two actually operate closely connected. And myself as a student, researcher of what's going on in Afghanistan, and as an advisor to some of the players, yes, I do some work bottom up, and I do some work top down. They have to go together. A little plea on, or a little comment on any attempt to try to deal with these in isolation. The reality is that our top-down processes at the moment are blocked. We've tried engaging with the Taliban political commission in Qatar. We can send as many people over there to talk as we like, but that engagement hasn't generated a meaningful peace process. It hasn't stopped anyone being killed. We've tried our regional engagement and tried to get Pakistan to play the role that many people desire of bringing the Taliban to the table. Many rounds of talks. It hasn't yet delivered in the Taliban sort of coming to the table in a meaningful way. We've had a couple of token visits. It's important to do these things, but waiting for a peace process, waiting for the guns to go silent on the basis of that, by itself could be a long wait. On the issue of bottom-up, this idea of engaging with the Taliban at a subnational level, Taliban in a particular province or in a particular district, that this can be an integral part of a political process which ultimately has as its goal a peaceful Afghanistan, but as its mode of operation for certain parts of it, engagement at the local. That's not some kind of separate community initiative to keep a few few people busy for the moment. That's a way of moving forward when other things are blocked. There's a critical design principle in here, which is around notion of critical path. I mean, I'm sure that I know that there are some important sort of students and teachers of strategy here. If you are trying to come up with a winning strategy, you do not want to set up a strategy which has got a single critical path which can easily be blocked by a single spoiler. That's where we've got at the moment at our attempts to trigger the top-down process. The advantage of the local is there is not a single critical path. Afghanistan has 34 provinces, it's got 400 districts. As long as you have opportunity to go forward in one or several of those, there is an opportunity to go forward. Afghanistan is networked. We deal with Taliban at the provincial and the district level. Demonstrate success there, build relationships there. You have a chance to spread that out across the country because, like the story of Facebook, ultimately every Taliban connects back to the leadership by one or two friendships. There is an opportunity to move from the local to the national. In dealing with people on both sides of the divide, of two major sides of the divide inside Afghanistan, I'm frequently both impressed, dismayed by the number who express a sense of disempowerment, a sense that they are not able to move forward in the positive direction that they want. That counts on the government side and on the Taliban side. If you are able to demonstrate that they, in a local initiative, that this is possible, you have a chance to overcome that sense of disempowerment. Now, I know that the Afghan president quite rightly has worried about issues of fragmentation. That the one thing I know that he does not want to see is efforts to somehow to peel off, to get little bits and fragments of the Taliban, because he's worried that you end up basically with twice as many groups, 3 times as many groups as you had before. The example of the multiple snakes via the bear. But there are opportunities for designing local initiatives which are not fragmentation, but actually offering an alternative vision of the future for movement as a whole, particularly at a point when even inside the leadership of the Taliban, they have a sense that they're blocked. They aren't coming up with the ideas and political vision, the sense to offer a better way forward. That a concentrated effort to achieve success at a local level has a chance to influence the leadership rather than just a chance to try and aggressively split off from them. So I think an effective vision of bottom-up contributing to a top-down process is one that demonstrates it is possible to achieve a peace dividend and play to the positive aspect of the Afghan dispute is that it's not really a zero-sum game. It's that ultimately the Taliban movement is a movement of Afghans, that although the official position of the movement is restoration of an Islamic emirate to the exclusion of any other political forces in the country, I think a majority of those Taliban I have a chance to interact with realize that that is not attainable and that they will have to move away from that position, demonstrating an opportunity for ultimately Afghans to work together in local peace initiatives, Taliban, non-Taliban, is a chance of demonstrating the way away from this demand for restoration of the Islamic Emirate. The worst thing that we could do at such an opportunity is sit back and simply say, it can't happen. That nothing has worked in Afghanistan. That I had a part in a recent publication. We reviewed a series of small-scale initiatives which actually have operated. That I have sat through dialogue between senior people from the High Peace Council and members of the Taliban who have demonstrated that it is possible to link local initiatives with ideas of an eventual national settlement in Afghanistan. The best time to start that is now.
Thanks very much, Erica.
Thank you. So for the last year and a half, Kate and I have been engaged in a project where we've been looking at militias and local forces, sort of their role and their impact. It's a comparative project, so both in Afghanistan and Iraq. And while that might seem a little bit distinct or sort of tangential from our topic today, a lot of what we've been finding on the ground, I think, has a lot of bearing for what might be the prospects for peace from the bottom up, or for different reintegration, or these sort of larger questions afterwards. So that's what I want to focus on today. And I think it's important because as many obstacles as there are to a top-down political settlement, I think the even harder challenge is going to be getting that deal to stick. And critical among that is going to be this question of what you do with all of the different fighters. How do you demobilize, reintegrate them, or otherwise deal with them in a way to get the peace deal to be sustainable? And when we talk about disarming, reintegrating, or sort of otherwise rationalizing different fighters, what I would argue is important is to not just think about what happens with the Taliban fighters, but also to think about what should happen with all of the different fighters and factions and groups that are currently aligned within the pro-government forces within the Afghan government itself. The last few years has seen a cycle of increasing fragmentation and proliferation of armed groups, from a trend towards militias and decentralization of control on the Afghan government side, or the pro-government side, to the multiple different Taliban factions and divisions on that side. And for any peace deal to be sustainable and to put the Afghan government on a more solid path in terms of being able to control and manage conflict, something has to be done with this multiplicity of actors on both sides. So to address that issue, I want to very briefly revisit some of the post-Bonn issues, that sort of bottom-up process that came after that, and then kind of talk about three larger challenges that might happen for trying to deal with these different armed groups should a peace deal be concluded. So the initial Bonn Agreement cobbled together a transitional government by bringing all the different factions, political stakeholders, warlords, and other parties into power. The overall strategy was one of addressing political conflict through accommodation by giving everyone a piece of the Afghan government apparatus. And there was a bottom-up component to that too, in that in addition to incorporating a lot of these key political actors or stakeholders on the top, they got to bring in all of their different fighting forces or militias into the Afghan government through security forces from the bottom up. In many cases, there was a wholesale incorporation of commanders and their different factions into the early Afghan security forces. I think Kate's going to talk a little bit more about this, so I'm not going to get into it fully. One other point that I think is important for my subsequent comments is that an additional factor, in addition to this sort of early incorporation of all of these different militias and factions, was that you had a continuing trend since 2001 of not only development according to the Afghan security forces, but also a range of different privatized sources of force, different local militias or other sort of quasi-state organs that continually provided a way to get around different demobilization and disarmament, and also allowed a lot of these larger political stakeholders keep their own security forces and factions. One of the ways that this has happened, it's been a focus of our study, is we've been looking at how the initiatives that started from 2009 on, that were largely international military forces driven, of promoting local forces, so local community defense forces, the largest of which has been the Afghanistan local police. Which now extends across Afghanistan. The local force models like the ALP certainly did not create the sort of market for violence or the logic of sort of securitized authority that is a problem right now in Afghanistan, but they certainly did reinforce those dynamics, and they gave a lot of these regional or local power brokers an opportunity to put their men on the payroll, an option to have local authority and legitimacy, and they sort of reinforced some of these larger cycles that were already ongoing, that were sort of present in the environment. The end result of all of these trends has been that the pro-government side of the house is incredibly divided, fragmented, factionalized, And though these trends have been ongoing since 2001 and to some extent preceded before this, they do appear to be reaching a crisis point. And you can see this both at a high level with the crises in the past year over Atta and Dostum, but you can also see it at a very local community level with an increasing number of communities falling out of the Afghan government orbit, and not necessarily because they're going over to the Taliban, but simply because they're dominated by these local interests or local power brokers who are acting in their own interests and not in the interest of Kabul or the Afghan government. So I would argue that any future political process will have to give attention to bringing in this range of fragmented, self-interested, and divided forces that exist on the pro-government side and the Afghan anti-government side into the tent. And that it's going to have to do that not only from a top-down level, but also from a bottom-up. And this makes any discussion about reintegration or demobilization one that, that certainly has to be part of it, but what we're also talking about is a larger rationalization of the security apparatus in Afghanistan, which starts to look a lot more like how do we address the issues of security sector reform and SSR, which have been a perennial frustration as part of the state strengthening or state building project since 2001. There's not enough time here to unpack that entire strategy and what that would look like, so I just want to talk about 3 challenges that would have to be addressed or that will come up should a peace deal be concluded. 2 of them tend a little bit more towards a sort of pessimistic or negative, but I will conclude with a somewhat optimistic point, reinforcing some of Michael's about bottom-up initiatives. The first will be that the challenge to actually disarm and bring the numbers down, because this will likely go against the interests of everyone that's at the bargaining table. So a key component of a successful peace strategy, or hopefully a key outcome, will be that conflict is reduced, which means that you don't need as many security forces because you have a greater prevalence of peace in Afghanistan. So this, in theory, this means that we should be moving towards a lower number of security forces. However, this will be challenging because it will go against the grain of the larger logic and approach to political negotiations since 2001. Since 2001, ongoing, the operating principle has been keeping all parties on side through this policy of accommodation. If you're going to put it in the sense of business and negotiation frameworks, it would be expanding the pie, which has largely involved, put all of my militias and my cousin on the payroll. This pressure will tend to increase rather than decrease in the future. We've already discussed this trend happening on the pro-government side, and all of those different factions and political stakeholders will be equally dug in to have their share of security forces to keep them, possibly even to increase them. We're also likely to see that on the Taliban side, particularly for these sort of local force models and for force numbers with that. Where past peace deals have been attempted, whether that's at a very local level peace compact or whether it was, say, the 2016 deal with Hezbi Islami, a frequent expectation of the forces has been that they will get some security positions. So you can certainly expect that. Michael might be able to touch on this more, but I think because of the commander model within the Taliban, and because some of the statements they've indicated, it's more likely that they would want, if any security position, something along the lines of the sort of local force model like the ALP, rather than being integrated into the larger Afghan security force structure. As a result, the tenets and the logic of this accommodation strategy would likely be to increase rather than decrease the number of positions, particularly among these local forces. Another final factor is that you might see the same pressures driving from the international military strategy. So even if a peace deal was concluded, you would expect that there will be significant outstanding security concerns. One, because we expect it to be a little bit fragile at the beginning, and there's not complete command and control on the anti-government side, but also because certain actors won't be brought into the fold, like ISK. And so they're unlikely to be reconciled and will pose persistent threats. So for this first one, you have this fundamental tension between a larger need to reduce forces and to demobilize, but the fact that all parties at the table will have an interest in expanding the forces that are out there. Second, the type of forces that are likely to be most in demand as the sort of reintegrative forces or as bargaining chips on the table are those local forces, which have tended to have a mixed record in terms of producing stability, or at least have not proven to be the right solution in all areas. We've been looking at this issue of where does this local force model work and where does it not, and there's a lot of competing it depends a little bit on how you judge what's working or not. But one common estimation that's been made by international military working with these forces has been, you know, if you take the ALP, that they work well in a third of the places, they're outright counterproductive in another third, and another third are somewhere in between. So given that, if, you know, say in 2/3 of the country, this is a force model that's tended to exacerbate local conflict, to increase divisions, to not cohere towards greater Afghan state control, that's a problem if that is also the primary model that allows you to try and integrate different fighters. A final challenge, and I've gotten already my clue that I have to stop soon, but this is it, and this is the slightly more positive. A final challenge will be the actual prospects of making that reconciliation happen within communities, given the charged local violence of the last few years. So one of the consequences that we've noted as a result of some of the local force mobilization has been that this sort of localization of the conflict, this mobilizing and arming and militarizing communities and sort of weaponizing their local knowledge and relationships has resulted in a much uglier and much bloodier type of violence, that it's sort of transgressed a lot of Afghan norms and restraints of conflict, and it's led for a lot more sort of tit-for-tat and revenge attacks, and would be an issue in terms of the sustainability of peace for the future. This will pose a certain challenge, but interestingly, in some of our research, we've also seen that notwithstanding that it got to this bloodier and sort of more dangerous level, that there was still, even in the worst communities where you had the worst levels of violence, some possibility to turn a new leaf, to sort of move forward and do peace. And interesting, a lot of that has come from the Taliban side, or some of the more interesting examples. So for example, although our research has demonstrated, and AAN has a forthcoming piece coming out soon on this, that initially the Taliban looked at the ALP and the local forces as enemy number one and were incredibly brutal, that from 2014 on, they increasingly pursued a strategy of co-option and cooperating. There's a couple examples that the new piece will document in Andar, but you've also had this in Kunduz, with areas that were retaken by the Taliban, kind of going up to the local ALP and saying, hey, if the elders vouch for you, we'll allow you, ALP, to integrate into our Taliban-controlled community. So it is interesting that, you know, that is happening on the Taliban side, and it's happening in a lot of these very divided communities. And I think it does suggest that there is still room for pragmatism and reconciliation at a local level. And this is my final point, I promise. This has largely happened where communities were left to their own devices and able to sort things out on a local level. As Steve mentioned earlier, and I think as Michael did too, there have been a lot of these local peace deals and accommodation of fighters. The issue so far has been that they haven't been very sustainable, and that's in part because they weren't backed with the sort of the backbone of a larger peace deal. So you know, there was lots of spoilers, and it was easy for them to fray and fall apart. So I will conclude with saying that this does offer a point of optimism, which is where I'll leave this, that if a top-level accord was struck, it does provide an opening for these local peace deals to gain some more traction. So with that, I'll leave it to you.
Great. And thank you for a good optimistic endpoint that I want to come back to.
Thanks, Erica. I was in Kabul in April and Brussels in May, and I was struck in both locations how much peace is in the air, at least on the international side. That's both military and civilian. At least people are talking about peace. And on the sort of international supporters or donors or great powers side, they're wondering how they can help. In the absence of a peace process, of course, that's actually quite difficult. There seems to be a singling out of reintegration. I've kept hearing this term. Now, I know it's slightly problematic, as Steve was talking about. Reintegrating armed men into civilian society is what's being discussed, and in particular at the moment, of course, the Taliban. Now, as Eric has pointed out, who's Taliban and who's not is actually often not as clear as it ought to be. And we've seen since 2001 that armed men and militias have been surprisingly persistent They've often been rehatted. They've often been called something different, but you find that they tend to carry on and emerge in a different guise. And one of the issues I'm a bit worried about at the moment is that in the absence of anything serious happening, putting in money into reintegration is poison. You might as well destroy any hopes of a peace process at the onset. You add money into the mix and people start to follow the money, and you don't get a resolution of the conflict. You get, as we've seen in the last 17 years, you get corruption. You actually get a sort of a greater militarization, and you often get a consolidation of the strongest commanders at the expense of the weaker. And actually, those who give up their weapons end up being weaker. So strangely, DDR often ends up promoting military forces in Afghanistan. So just briefly, we've had 4 formal programs of DDR, which I'll call it. So we've had 2 aimed at pro-government forces, which was the Afghanistan New Beginnings Program, and so that's ANBP, and the Disbandment of Illegal Armed Groups Program, DIAG. We've had 2 dealing with the Taliban, Program Tahkim Sulh, PTS, and then the continuing one of the Afghanistan Peace and Reintegration Program, ANBP. I'm right in thinking that UNDP has been involved in all of them. And often you have the same personnel, both on the UN side and on the Afghan side, also being involved. So people like Masoom Stanekzai was involved in DIAG, for example. So with the initial attempts to scale back the large numbers of men who were supposedly fighting the Taliban in 2001, estimates went up to 800,000, which frankly, if they had been fighting the Taliban, they wouldn't have been, the Taliban would not have gained 90% of the territory. But anyway, that was brought down to, I think it was over 200,000. Probably there were about 80,000 actually fighting. So immediately you get money involved, you get an expansion of the payroll, whether that's actual people or just people who can get a salary on someone else's behalf. What you found was, so these are all the forces that came under the nominal control of the Ministry of Defence in 2001, 2002. You found the people with the strongest links went with their men into the Afghan police. You had others who joined the Taliban when they were DDR'd. You had others who became guards for the foreign military. So that was the, poor Afghan people. They thought that when ISAF expanded, ISAF would protect them from the various commanders and militia leaders who were abusing them. But no, ISAF actually chose them to guard their bases and work with them as partners for force protection. So again, you had the militias being rehatted as guards for ISAF. Those who were disarmed came out at a disadvantage. So that was the first attempt at DDR. DIAG, which was supposedly looking at the remains of those forces, unfortunately came up against 2 things. One, ISAF expansion into the south, so a fresh need for militias to guard bases and to guard transports, and the expansion of the insurgency. So you had a disarming and you had a rearming. And in both times, the international military protected its people. It protected the militias that it wanted to stay functioning. And you found that at senior level, on the sort of the Afghan power broker side, you also had them managing to protect their own people. Since then, we've had 2 attempts to reintegrate the Taliban. The PTS claimed to have reintegrated 800,000. When I looked at they showed me a list of their senior people that they'd brought over. There were 12, and none of them were senior people. So then that was followed by, you probably remember the peace jirga that Karzai ran in 2010 when he set up the High Peace Council. He created, I think it was 70 posts at that point. And this was in response to, again, a demand for peace at the time, which I think was referred to in the earlier session. This was Karzai's response, was to set up the High Peace Council and the Afghanistan Peace and Reconciliation Programme. And many of us at the time just thought it was a sham. It was a sham organisation designed to funnel international money into the pockets of various people. So that, you know, it's a great way for former President Karzai to fund his patronage, part of his patronage network, with 70 mainly jihadi commanders there. It hasn't done anything. It's done very, very little. It's supposedly reintegrated 10,000 fighters. Most of them weren't Taliban. Most of them were friends and relations of people who were getting benefits of the packages, mainly in the north and the west. I think it worked out at $18,000 per reintegree. So even if they'd all been Taliban, it would have been a very, very, very costly process. And at the moment, UNDP is again looking for more money to extend the programme, the AMBP. As Steve Brooking also spoke about, the Joint Secretariat of the High Peace Council has been trying to get money in Kabul. There was a lovely paragraph in the latest CIGAR report about this. So if you have a look at the UNDP website, it's full of the achievements of the Afghanistan Peace and Reintegration Programme. But apparently in the briefing note to the donors, including State Department, so UNDP wrote that the new project would be informed by lessons learned from the previous APRP programme, which it described as overly ambitious, assumption-laden, structurally unsustainable, lacking accountability, and producing no satisfactory results. And then you're asking for $30 million more. I mean, you couldn't make it up. You really couldn't make it up. CIGAR said State Department had reported that the donors, the funding note had been well received by donors. You can see why I'm worried. Because if you are to have a genuine peace process, it needs to be genuine. You don't want to have money being siphoned off, I'm sorry to say, ahead of an election, into people's pockets. It needs to be seen to be genuine. And this is not the beast. Just one last thing before we finish, or a couple of things. Lessons from this. Putting money in is dangerous. Money incentivizes the continuation of armed groups and militias in Afghanistan. Also, it doesn't incentivize Taliban, at least, to put down their arms. I mean, there's been a lot of assertions that the Taliban fight for money. At least they don't put down their arms for money. So that's one thing. Secondly, the international powers have been completely incompetent at following the money. They've been continually exploited by Afghan politicians and commanders. And what you've had is these programs have fueled corruption, and they've fueled inequality. They've fueled, I'd say, a privileging of armed men and the leaders of armed men. So again, really bad for civilians and women in particular. Thirdly, for this sort of thing to work, you need a genuine peace process. Otherwise, just don't start it. And fourthly, I'd say, and this is a really sort of general remark, keep development and incentivizing security separate. I mean, once you start having the military funding development as a means to try and create peace, you end up with lots of wasted money, lots of graft, and it doesn't really help poor Afghans. So that's the last point I'd make. So we know what hasn't worked. in terms of the last 17 years, in terms of trying to reduce violence by trying to reduce the number of armed men. And I feel I'm going to
That's fine.
pass on to you now, Nilufer, because I think you're going to talk about what has worked. Is that correct?
I don't know.
Is that a good segue?
I'm a very
Good.
optimist person, so I give opportunities.
Good.
Well, thank you very much, Kat. Shall I start, Scott?
Please.
All right. Good afternoon or evening, everyone. I would like to start with a very positive note of being in the peace building from last at least 15, 16 years, both academically and as a practitioner. I would like to say that I'm very optimistic about peace process in Afghanistan. Why? Because of looking at the civil movement in various provinces from last at least couple of years, we have seen that people are craving for peace and people have taken their own steps now and decided to step in. For me, I would see peace not as a political settlement. It's not a deal. It's a process, organic, as mentioned in the very first session. So it has its challenges, and we are in the middle of those challenges right now. I hope we as Afghans will be able to deal with it because it's our process, and we own it, and it's our peace. So we have to be very much into the process. I would focus on reintegration and peace, particularly. Colleagues here has already mentioned the background and processes. I'm going to put some opportunities which already worked on it and have potentials to rather prevent people to join Taliban or help reintegration process further if it's going to start again or if we have a process in future. I think Afghanistan peace process has been through two major stages. I mean, as a whole, if I categorize it, it's reintegration and reconciliation. The reintegration initiative soon started in 2003, mentioned by Kat also, through DDR, followed by DIAG, and then the establishment of Al-Baqi forces, which have been marked partially a success, as the number has been already highlighted here, was a top-down approach. I mean, it's accepted that this should be a top-down approach, where the central government strategized a national plan and executed at provincial and local level through inline ministries. On the other side, the reconciliation process also, which involved transitional justice, negotiation with Taliban representative, and regional diplomacy, have also remained a top-level approach for peace. So all these processes are considered top-level approaches. Though the elite-based local initiative, particularly local commanders, a strongman, and some religiously active and known individuals were consulted and involved throughout these stages, but society in large, with its multiple sectors, who could help the reintegration and peace processes, has been excluded from the process. Or their role has been symbolic, let's put it that way, if they were even included. So overall, I think that reintegration efforts and peace process efforts in Afghanistan, which we are talking about the bottom top, consisted of a certain set of activities with minimal involvement of people from all walks of life, with lack of comprehensive plan to monitor and evaluate reintegrated cases afterwards. No doubt the program had their impact to integrate some, but could not ensure full reintegration of illegal armed groups due to lack of inclusiveness of key stakeholders, where it resulted in another set of hurdles in peace process. For instance, DDR has further strengthened the local commanders in defeating their rivals and securing governmental and parliamentary positions. DIAC has opened up the government institutions for criminals and tax. So that was kind of another result of both the processes which has been through the stages. Now here's the question, who are Taliban? Who could be and who can be reintegrated? And what are the opportunities exist at local level now and could be created in order to reintegrate or prevent local communities to join them? Based on the evidences, there are two categories of Taliban. The first category is Taliban allied militias, largely recruited by local strongmen. And second category is those regular fighters directly under the control of military commissions. Now, I think it would be challenging to reintegrate those, the second category of Taliban, who are multinationals and possibly recruited from outside, and are under the command of military commissions. It's difficult to reintegrate them and talk about their reintegration at the local level, especially when we are talking. However, the first category of Taliban who are locally recruited, reside locally, and are part of social networks of either a village, district, or a province in Afghanistan can be reintegrated in society, but certainly with some structural changes within the program and local level. What those structural reform or changes should look like, it's again based on the series of experiences that we have been through reintegration processes. First of all, reintegration of Taliban should be administered and managed locally, not nationally. Why I'm saying that because every province in Afghanistan has its own social and political interpretation of war and peace. As our friend from Afghanistan has mentioned very clearly, even in some non-Pashtun provinces like Badakhshan and Badghis, the war with Taliban is not considered a war between armed group insurgents or the government of Afghanistan. Rather, an ethnic conflict between Pashtun and non-Pashtun. Similarly, they have their own interpretation of what peace is, what peace and reconciliation is. Peace for some provinces doesn't mean really a political settlement or power balance, but for them, they mean, yes, more minorities included in the government position. For some provinces, it means more provision of services and especially economic services to the underdeveloped provinces. So the interpretation of war and peace in provinces, it makes us think about some structural changes required for overall peace processes, especially reintegration, to think locally. The platform should decide what the strategy and what activities should be designed, and they should submit to the national government for execution. Now, therefore, designing one national plan for reintegration and executing it nationally did not work effectively, or I believe will not work effectively throughout the country, because it will not buy in people's interest and confidence, and people will not trust the process. Based on my recent interviews with some in Kandahar and Herat, most of the people believe that reintegration has been a symbolic effort of national peace process. They don't believe that it was really a genuine organic process. So until people do not own the process and trust it, they will not cooperate with the process also. That's why the conceptual framework of reintegration should remain as a guideline for all the provinces, but the implementation consists of assessment of target population to be involved, role of local government directorate offices, role of security, private security firms, and the national security, kinds of services or incentive that has to be provided, information dissemination mechanism, role of moderate religious group, and certainly civil society engagement. All these points needs to be decided locally and developed locally. Local provincial network and local initiative that is already developed, by the way, by our High Peace Council and by many, many NGOs around the country. But they don't have, they're fund-based, they are project-based. They operate whenever they have funds. They don't operate whenever there is no fund. So they should be mobilized and empowered. And I'm not sure about allocation of money, how it's gonna work or not. But these councils or this shura could be a platform to further engage more stakeholders in the province, at the provincial level. And by inclusion over here, I mean the people from businesses, the NGOs, community centers, Islamic councils, education institutions, they should be all part of these platforms to make a strategy for reintegration and reconciliation. The second aspect which I see would help the process is the reintegration process is negotiating a strategy or pact with village and tribal elders at each province level could be helpful and reintegration of armed opposition back in the community. Okay. Yeah, and now who should be in charge at the community level, especially when we are talking about it? So villages or district should decide, should elect their own representatives to lead the reintegration process. A person should not come from the province, from the local directorate and lead them. They should decide and they should elect about who should be in charge of reintegration process. The other aspect which is attached to it is the deterioration of security overall, it has, in many, many provinces, I traveled recently, has damaged the government reputation in building peace and reintegration efforts. Most of the villages controlled by local strongmen now have a strong justification of illegal armed group controlling their village or district, as they believe government cannot secure them anymore. Therefore, building trust and confidence of people in government should be another objective of peace and reintegration process, and to mobilize people at local level and have them cooperate with the process. This could certainly happen through maintaining some level of security, which is recently offered by President Ghani. A ceasefire could have been an effective strategy, but I hope it will gonna work. It still didn't work. But until then, people will not see any change and decline in violence. They probably don't trust any peace and reintegration processes. And the last, and the other aspect which I have, which we have noticed, especially during my research as well, which is not highlighted in peace and reintegration, is the economic element. There is an economic interest at local level that has direct relation with both insurgency and reintegration. Narcotic trade, illegal mining, and illegal selling of public lands are three major economic interests the Taliban have in terms of their economic gains from where they generate resources to sustain the fight and also have control of the reputation in almost every province. So they pay communities to join them, they force them and to sell their lands, and they also grab the lands in many cases. So it should be an agenda to discuss with them at local level, to discuss with community elders at local level how to tackle this, especially if they are reintegrating people. Last but not the least, I have seen throughout this time entirely in the peace process that radicalization of society has also an impact on the entire peace-making and peace-building initiative. I have seen this element an important factor for people joining Taliban and also justifying Taliban cause. The religious leaders and scholars have had prominent role and impact on people's opinion and their objectives about Taliban and Taliban objectives. So that those elements of people should be encouraged and should be worked on at the local level to dismantle the forces who are encouraging Taliban, who are encouraging to join Taliban. So this forces has to be supported and expanded. And to conclude, I would like to say that Taliban insurgencies in Afghanistan is extremely disorganized. And this disorganization is due to lack of consensus mostly among Taliban leadership, starting from Quetta Shura to Rasul Shura. They have been, throughout this period, we have seen that how disorganized their messages were, their disorganization and lack of consensus on some of the movement that they had in Afghanistan. So therefore, supporting local governance building through building local initiatives in all 34 provinces with focus on people's participation for developing a strategy of reintegration and negotiation could help prevent joining insurgency and Taliban at the local level. This is a long-term process. I think it will require longer time, no doubt, the organization and institutionalization of such approach at local level. But it's important to put more efforts on them at this time, since, especially when our friend Michael Semple said that at the top now everything seems to be blocked. So good to put more effort at the local level because it can at least, if nothing else, at least it could create more confidence and trust on the government from people's side. Thank you.
Great, thank you all. Really a rich set of comments. I want to make a couple observations, ask a question, and then I'll open it up to the audience. I mean, one thing that I think is striking to me that in the first panel we focused, I mean, by design on the geopolitical, on the ideological, on the kind of national political motivations for the conflict. But when you look at it and what you hear, what I hear from each of you in various ways is that at the more local level, there are a lot of practical considerations that are driving this. It's armed force, security forces, militias as protection against others that when you don't believe that you're safe, either from the government or from your rivals. It's as income and employment for your largely young men, but your people. And then it's also as a chip, if you will, to ensure political inclusion in a system that doesn't necessarily guarantee that otherwise. And it's interesting to think about those elements of armed force and conflict as drivers, in addition to the kind of larger and vexing geopolitical issues. You know, Michael, you said this explicitly, but I want to give the other panelists a chance to weigh in on what I think is a current discussion in Kabul as part of at least the military strategy, being to apply pressure on the Taliban through various means, militarily, pressure on Pakistan and so forth, in order to increase the cost of fighting so that they will then leave the fight. And I think you said fragmentation makes it more difficult to negotiate. I'm just curious from the other panelists' perspectives and what you've said, you know, as this pressure, let's assume, increases on the Taliban, what are actual incentives to give up the fight at the local level? And you've answered, Kate, that providing money is not the answer. But are there things at the community level that could be done, or is the fragmentation approach, you know, not the right one? I don't know who wants to lead on that.
Right. Well, in general, this war will continue until one side loses its backing. I can't see any other way, unless there's a peace process. So I can't see the war finishing in any other way because there's too many drivers to conflict, and they're not really ideological. I would say it's more the economy of the war and the way that it's somehow the default position in Afghanistan from both Afghans and its backers. So actually making peace is a much braver and more courageous and more difficult thing than just carrying on fighting or just carrying on funding or supporting the war. So one of the problems with that, I would say, let's take the American point of view, the fear would be if you don't carry on supporting the government, then the government collapses and you have a civil war. And then you have a more destabilized area which is more conducive to groups like Al-Qaeda and ISKP operating. I'd say that's the reason why the Americans are still involved in Afghanistan, along with nuclear-armed Pakistan next door. If you stop the support, then because the state is highly dependent on foreign aid, I think it's about 45% of GDP is foreign aid, and the armed forces can't operate without the foreign support. It's basically you're allowing the war to continue. But it also means that the elites at the centre don't actually have to take really full responsibility for the country. They don't have to generate the income, they don't have to tax people, they don't have to run the country properly because of the foreign support. So I think it's a bit of a bind, really, as to what you do as a country that wants Afghanistan to prosper and doesn't want to see total state collapse, as we saw in 1992 with the withdrawal of Soviet funds. Now, I would say, after 2016, I think there was, with all the territory being lost to the Taliban and the Afghan government really showing no ability to sort of galvanize its own resources or its own armed forces to protect people, to protect its own people and protect territory, then either the US government had to either cut its losses or support. But if you're supporting, then there has to be an end game. You can't support the current Afghanistan, you can't support it forever because there isn't a way out of this. It's a status quo that carries on as war. So I would say that on a sort of general theme, if you're supporting the war, you have to also be looking at ways to support the peace. Otherwise, there's no point. Whether you walk away now or you walk away in 10 years' time, it sort of doesn't matter. You have to try and find a way out of the impasse whereby the foreign support also enables the government to be not very good at what it does and to not be inclusive and, you know, for the elites to bicker over appointments while they're losing territory in the sticks. I would say at the moment, the US military in Kabul anyway gets this. I think they've turned a corner, and I mean, as Barney Rubin said, Liz Curtis, Lisa Curtis, Lisa, was, you know, the normal bland sort of government statements that we tend to get. It was actually very interesting in terms of putting peace at the front of what's happening. To move on to actually something practical is more difficult. But I think you do have to have both, or you shouldn't actually have either. Military without serious support for a peace process won't win the war, but it won't lead to peace by itself.
Thanks. Any other comments on that?
Yeah. Nicola coming first? No, let Nicola go. I'll follow.
Well, I think I believe there should be another approach to peace process. You're right, Kat. I mean, at some point, there will not be any money. Even now, the money has shrunk to many, many efforts in Afghanistan. And that's why the peace initiatives that I mentioned at local level, I have direct interaction with many of them. Most of them stopped their work even. Most of them stopped working with people, with communities. And there are less peace initiatives right now at the community level because there is no donor funding anymore. So I think the entire peace process in Afghanistan, unfortunately, has been treated as a project, as a donor-funded project, not as a process that could rely, that could take on without even funding. So it is developed, strategized based on that particular funding that was available to it. So I think that has to be taken out. That approach has to be taken out, and it's still early. Still, we're at good stages if we take the whole peace process out of this blob of funding, international funding scenario. That's why local initiative over here work very well, because until and unless people will not see that's their process and it's only based on a certain amount of fund if they reach, they will never cooperate with the process and they will never think about having a genuine role in the processes. And at the back of my mind, there's always something, as an Afghan also, that's something really, worry me about. Unless and until Afghanistan is weak, both military-wise and economic-wise, as an Afghan, I don't really see a prospect of peace. I don't see, as Barney has mentioned, the war, the decades of war. Maybe tomorrow we will not have Taliban, we will have another entity fighting. So Afghanistan needs, I think, it should be an element of peace process. A strengthening economy and a strengthening military should be an element and a component of peace process. I think this too can lead us to sustainable peace process. I mean, and even sustainable means that not a particular deal or political settlement for timely matter, but something that could lay a framework for future progress of Afghanistan.
Yeah. The basic question you asked is, what is the local deal in a peace deal? Well, the thing about the local deal in Afghanistan is very simple. It's, we don't kill you, you don't kill us. That's the essence of the local deal. It's it's an armistice. Now, it may sound very sort of crude and simple, but at a time when actually many have come to question the conflict, I mean, that is the sort of, that is the first deal that people need. That they hear, that's what we hear from civilian population they desire, and those those in the Taliban who have sort of moved beyond the stage of in a sense the earnest desire for martyrdom, that's what they're concerned about. And in terms of design of approaches to the drivers of conflict, having a very simple first move is very attractive. If you to ask me as to what are the contents of the settlement in Afghanistan which will deliver sustainable peace, I mean, it's got lots of chapters. We're talking about property rights. We're talking about the role of Islam in the constitution. We're talking about the reconstitution of the security forces. This is an impressive list. We heard some references to it earlier on in the first panel, but that's going to take an awful long time to reach. The confidence which is required to reach agreement on, say, the 10 chapters required for the broad-based settlement. That does not exist. It is impossible to achieve it. You cannot get the compromise required because people don't trust each other to be a bit flexible on the other chapter which matters for us so that you get the chapter that matters for you. So the local deal, which is we don't kill you, you don't kill us, is incredibly simple. It is actually doable, and it brings another component to it which can be explicit or implicit, which is a re-establishment of relationships and an agreement to deal with each other. Which is required, of course, for starting the process of building the confidence that you require to work through all those chapters which are involved in this sense, the real settlement in Afghanistan. Now, when it comes down to sort of the thinking about timelines and optimism, I mean, I'm looking around there, right, there's some veterans here. I'm looking at Marvin here in terms of, Marvin can sit here and he can envisage, you can think through the 4 decades of conflict already because you've witnessed every single one of them. And I'm so glad to see you here today, able to, in a sense, to study them, comment, to offer wisdom to those who do not have that depth of engagement. Now, it's realistic that you and I, Marvin, will live to see a decline in violence. I'm not going to bet on either or both of us being around to see the great, to hold the golden grail of the sustainable peace settlement. But the first bit is important. It can turn the trend round. It can restore hope. It can move people. In other words, it doesn't give you the sustainable peace, but it can give you the peace process. So that's the importance of the bottom up. It's doable. It delivers a dividend. It can store hope in a situation where there's a real crisis of confidence that anything works. There's a real crisis. A botched international intervention that generated so much hope, maybe unrealistic in 2001. Now, in a sense, is a source of cynicism when it comes down to 2018. So a bottom-up process which delivers on one very simple, fundamental thing, which brings down violence and reduces the fear that Afghans have of being killed, of their children not coming home alive in the evening. That's what's required to get a peace process underway.
Can I just say one thing, add to that? It's not in isolation. You need the top-level buy-in. And we've seen this with various peace deals that have been done in Helmand, 2006 and 2010, where locals actually got really good deals on the ground between local Taliban and local elders. And they were sabotaged either by bits of the international military bombing the peacemakers or by very cynical people at provincial and central government level who did not want these deals to happen for sort of petty political reasons. So don't underestimate the ability of the big powers, whether that's provincial or central government or the international military, to actually sabotage bottom-up peacemaking. And I do think at least, I think the situation now in Kabul, both on the military and certainly on the military side, is much better. It's more aware of these things. I stick my neck out. There are, of course, people who still think the main aim is killing Taliban, but generally I'd say you need the top-down support for these. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, they end up being sabotaged and you end up with increased violence.
I'm going to the audience next, but let me ask
I'll
Eric
just add one.
for
Well,
her
just
comments as well.
to circle back to your original question, which I think was getting at whether, as a sort of military strategy, you can use the bottom up to get to the top down, either by military pressure on the ground level forces or by trying to peel them away to a reintegrative process. And I would just say the takeaway, I think, from all of our different contributions in this panel is that maybe that's not the right way to conceive the bottom up, either because the military pressure just, if it didn't work at sort of the height of power, will it work at this territory of control? Like Kate said, there's often been inadvertent consequences in terms of that military pressure inadvertently scuppering local peace deals. And then also, like Kate brought up, a lot of times what you've seen with this attempt to peel off when you don't have this top level trust has been sort of fake reintegrative efforts. It hasn't been the actual fighters. So I think that is not the right strategy or way to think about it.
Okay, let me see a show of hands. Let me get the lady in the middle, then you, and then at the end. And then we'll go for a second round.
Hi, I just want to say real quickly, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules. And thank you also for clarifying what this reintegration would look like with the local forces and local Taliban. But I feel like that phase is a two-part question. After we do conclude a peace compromise, and if that included U.S. military pulling out, how can we secure implementation and security, especially if all local factions have a piece of this government, or if that is a possibility, could not allowing all factions into the forces in effect cause another civil crisis in Afghanistan, or even worse, an election that could be rigged or threatened? And I know Mr. Simple did say that we don't kill you and you won't kill us, but as you can see, history does show that is not always true, and there is a lot of Afghan blood on Afghanistan's hands. So I was wondering what you think would be the best part of this reintegration.
Thanks. Can you hand the microphone ahead of you?
Oh, thank you. Unfortunately, this may be more of a comment than a question, but there's a question in it. I've worked in areas where people have agreed that they're not going to kill you and you're not going to kill me. And then there's no way to support themselves. They have no opportunity to work to support their families. There's got to be the economic component that allows people to get, support have a livelihood if any peace initiative is going to be sustained. And I don't hear enough of that in this conversation.
Thanks. I promise the gentleman over there, if we can get a microphone to him.
Thank you very much. My name is Muhib Jabarkhil. I was a former Fulbright and now leading Afghans for Afghanistan's development organization. I would start with a quote from my father, who is a veteran of the anti-Soviet war. And he says that in Afghanistan's context, peace cannot be brought by force nor by begging. It can be forced, it can be brought by begging. You have to find the root causes, address those root causes, and then peace will prevail. It seems in the Afghan context, for a very long time, those two things have been happening. Either it has been forced in, or there is a sort of a begin for it that, okay, that somehow peace will prevail. Now, what are the root causes? From experience, I think there are three major things that still does not seem to be targeted. First, what Nilofer Jan also mentioned, economic underdevelopment in Afghanistan. Afghanistan economy has become a war economy. People will have incentive to grow poppy if there isn't an alternative. There has not been any significant focus on a viable alternative economic development that can bring in people. Second, governance. I think the governance structure that is there and overall the way it functions is not effective. It's significantly ineffective. Even in the elections, one party won and we couldn't resolve it. The resolution was not to stick to the rules of the game, but to create a coalition government that continues to contribute to a very ineffective approach of governance. And finally, those destructive regional politics. Regional politics, regional players play a very significant role in the Afghan quagmire. There has not been any approach in dealing with all those three things. So my question is, do you agree that there has not been a holistic plan to address all those three things? Economic underdevelopment, governance issues, and of course, regional politics.
Thank you. Let me go down the row and just get reactions to what you like.
Yeah, just an economic element, which is where my heart goes a lot in peace processes. I agree with you, ma'am. I mean, yes, I don't remember exactly which year, but BBC released once a report surveying people in Kandahar, Helmand, and some other provinces. I don't recall now. It was, I think, in 2004 or 5 somewhere. They had interviewed with people joining Taliban. And I remember and recall those interviews. And most of the interviewees were saying that they were joining Taliban because Taliban was paying them $300 and government of Afghanistan was paying them $50 as a per month salary. So the economic element that you have highlighted has a lot to do with insurgency in Afghanistan, has a lot to do with Taliban and community people joining Taliban insurgency. It's people don't have food to eat, they don't have shelter to live, they want food for their children. So that aspect is specifically, yes, missing from the peace processes. There's a lot of talk about it, but we haven't seen a master mega plans around the country from last more than a decade now that really focus on this particular element to prevent people joining Taliban insurgency, as my friend over here mentioned a lot as well. And yeah, there has been a lack of comprehensive plans. I mean, that could really focus particularly on this economic element. And this is not that it's rising now. I remember in 2002, when there was a talk about reconciliation in Kabul, we have raised at Kabul level, group of us have raised this element a lot, that Afghanistan needs mega economic project to fight with insurgency. And that was an issue with many of us, from civil society, from government, from think tanks, from education institutions. We have raised at the palace also that a lot. With to the international community, to USA, the State Department, we went and we knocked every door, most of us, that this should be under the comprehensive plan of peace, because the context is very weak economically. And if you don't take care of this issue, people will join insurgency very, very quickly. So yes, my answer is there hasn't been a comprehensive plan on this.
When was the BBC report?
I think it was 2004. I don't recall, 2004.
Yeah,
5.
yeah.
I think that was that time.
I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong. If you look at all the academic and non-academic research on why the insurgency started, certainly why it started, it was to do with predatory government and predatory US special forces. And not only singling out Taliban who'd surrendered and defeated and gone home, but Afghan rivals of Afghan power holders. It was very, very, very clear that this was to do with people's feelings of injustice. Now, I don't think you can say that that's the reason for the insurgency now, but that was how it started. And certainly 2004, I don't think it was to do with money. And if it's to do with money, God forbid, we are stuck, because Afghanistan is a poor country, and the recent figures are that most people are getting poorer. I think the absolute poverty rate is now 56% of people living in absolute poverty. It's gone up. We've had lots and lots of money spent on development, and some people have got very rich, but a large number of people have not benefited from the intervention, and there's greater inequality. So if poverty was what was driving people to fight, then we're finished. We're finished. I think all of the evidence is that other things, at least the economy does not work in terms of persuading people to not fight. And I think you've seen that repeatedly over the last 17 years. I think the war economy is important, but it doesn't benefit ordinary people. It benefits a few people at the elite level. And whether it's narcotics or illegal mining, that's one thing, but it's also contracts, dodgy contracts in the security ministries, ghost soldiers, ghost police. A couple of things that I think were really telling for me when I was looking at the Ministry of Interior, and why that continues not to function properly. One of the issues was when you have a little checkpost in the middle of nowhere, the people on it are really, really vulnerable to Taliban attack. Plus, it doesn't actually protect people, and it doesn't protect territory. So from a military point of view, it doesn't work, and it puts the people on the checkpost at greater risk. So Resolute Support noticed this. They noticed the really high casualty rates of soldiers and police on these little checkposts, and said, we need to have a different way of trying to protect territory, and it's better if you have mobile units. And they had pushback from some of the governors and some of the generals who were pocketing money from people on checkposts, extorting money from travellers. And the money goes up the chain. So you have the people, in leadership positions who would rather that their people were vulnerable to Taliban attack than their income source was reduced. And this is the sort of I mean, I think this is the sort of economic issues that we should be looking at. It's not that, it's poverty is not the driver of the insurgency per se, but it's the way that people can make money out of the war and in ways that don't actually affect them. And just one thing quickly that Ashraf Ghani said before the election, which I think is really true, is that it's poor people who pay for this war. It's poor people who join up. They haven't got other advantages, but they're not the people who benefit. And he was talking about the ANSF. They're not the people that benefit, and the people that benefit aren't really suffering.
So let me get quick reactions from the other two panelists, and then thanks to the benefits of a very smooth transportation system, the ambassador has joined us, so I want to give him 10 minutes at the end. But
I'll cede my time to Michael and the ambassador, since we're short.
Noble. Yes, on the issue of livelihoods and the conflict, Kate presented very, very cogently. That's how it is. This was driven primarily by justice concerns, but then, of course, there is a conflict economy which has taken hold over it has developed over the 18 years of the current phase of the conflict. I absolutely agree that livelihoods would be fundamental in moving towards a sustainable peace, while also remembering Kate's appropriate warnings that just sort of throwing money at any promising local initiative is likely to poison it at source. So you have to get a sort of a balance there. Now, part of that balance is that the big picture is that we've moved beyond this idea of somehow a messy insurgency and a formal system of government which is being rebelled against. Afghanistan is now in a system which is basically a state of dualism, whereby as far as the lived reality of many people in the country, they're living the reality of the Taliban's Islamic Emirate. They didn't choose it. That's just the reality that they experience. Maybe many people, because of, and Afghanistan is a country where people move around, people have, they have relationships over long distances. In a sense, they experience both the Taliban's Islamic Emirate system and the system of Kabul government. And they have to sort of to navigate the two. Now, if you're talking about prospects of economic development, having two competing authorities with a claim over people and territory, makes it really difficult to proceed with economic development and to take advantage of all the opportunities which there are inside Afghanistan. So even starting with local initiatives, you're talking about overcoming the dualism. When I talked about the second part of the deal for bottom-up initiatives beyond "you don't kill us, we don't kill you" is a restoration of initiatives. It's opening up opportunities whereby that dualism is sort of broken down. So you're increasing opportunity for trade and investment and service delivery, basically. That's got to be the hope. And this is the kind of course there has to be a dividend. It's the more that it's possible to generate this kind of sense of organic dividend, that the economy works more to the benefit of the citizens. That's likely to be a more durable one, and one which is catching than just adding a few incentive payments for fake former Taliban. However, there is an important incentive system here, that the choice for senior members of Taliban in going along with the peace process is actually going to be part of, in a sense, which patronage system that they're involved in. Because being a Taliban commander is, for many of them, is not about being the sort of the radicalized individual who is dedicated his life at the price of being prepared to go to heaven more quickly than the rest of us. It's about being a key figure in a patronage system where he has relationships with people from other families in his area who entrust their young men to him on the basis that they will look after him. So that you basically in the local peace deal, you have to give him access to some of that patronage without killing people. You know what? He becomes more of an uncle than a commander. So the deal, so you have to redirect the patronage system pro-peace, and you create opportunities for overcoming the current dualism. Then local peace deals can start help build the basis of a sustainable peace.
Scott, just to add one point briefly. In terms of economic lens, I think I was not clear. I didn't mean to say that poverty is the only driver of conflict in Afghanistan, but I would again want to stress that poverty is one of the major components of drivers of conflict, and if that element had to be considered from the beginning under the plan of peace and reconciliation, I think some of the problems that we can see right now and people in community joining insurgency at local level, I think that could resolve some of those problems at this. But I never said that that's the only drivers of conflict on people joining conflict.
Great. With apologies to those that still had questions, I want to end this panel because we have closing remarks from the ambassador, who I will introduce in a minute. But first, let me ask for a round of applause and thank you to all of our panelists. And then as our speakers leave the stage, and I'll invite you to head over to the left, let me welcome Ambassador Hamdullah Mahib, who's the Afghan ambassador to the U.S. He's served in that role very capably for the last several years through presidential transition here, a new South Asia strategy that has seen sustained U.S. support, both civilian and military, for the Afghan government, which I think, as we've heard here earlier today, is badly needed, and it's a strong partnership that certainly we on this stage hope that endures. We've heard today, I think, a lot of challenges for the peace process, but also a lot of optimism that there are new things happening. Ambassador, earlier there were remarks about the two offers that the President Ghani has made, both at the Kabul process and then also today, announcing a unilateral ceasefire. And so there are discussions of peace. There are perhaps opportunities, although it won't come easily. And so with that as the stage, let me invite you up here, and we're very keen to hear your remarks.
Good afternoon. I think one of the advantages of arriving late and not having heard all the remarks means that I will stick to my script. So, colleagues and distinguished guests, thank you all for being here today. To Nancy, Andrew, Scott, Johnny, and all of our friends at USIP, thank you for hosting today's event. Thank you also to all the panelists. I would also like to thank Stephen Hadley, who is a dear friend of Afghanistan. USIP is one of the most important places in Washington to have a public discussion about peace in Afghanistan. So I thank you for your commitment to this issue. I'd like to close today's event by expanding on two areas of a complex and multi-layered concept of peace. First, what achieving a sustainable peace in Afghanistan entails, and second, what the Afghan government has put on the table and what we are doing to pursue peace. Sustainable peace will not be delivered in a negotiations on and a political settlement with the Taliban alone. A political settlement is but one part of a complicated and layered process of achieving sustainable peace. What matters equally is the peace-building work that precedes a peace deal and the maintenance work that follows it. Afghanistan is dealing with multiple issues which have manifested over the decades as a legacy of violence, warlordism, impunity, corruption, injustice, insurgency, international terrorism, a drug mafia that continues to respond to a growing global demand. All this, and we're still a very young democracy, grappling with providing services to our people, ensuring the integrity of democracy, and building our institutions. With this context, there are 6 core building blocks which must be considered in peace-building process. 1, we must focus on those reconcilable Afghan elements of the Taliban who have legitimate grievances. This is our target audience for a peace deal. We must address the legitimate grievances of those Afghans who have taken up arms against their government and fellow countrymen. We must answer those difficult questions, logistical, practical, and emotional, of how a nation forgives, how an insurgent is reintegrated, and what drove him to the gun in the first place, to make sure he's not driven to the gun again. The government's successful deal with Hizb Islami over a year ago gives us experience on how to structure a deal and what questions need to be addressed. 2, we must create a regional consensus on peace, stability, and economic growth. The region can either be divided by conflict or united by shared economic benefit. There is a regional component to the conflict playing in Afghanistan, which the United States administration and the Afghan government are both taking very seriously, so this element cannot be overlooked. 3, we will maintain political stability and democratic integrity through elections, which we'll hold in October and again in 2019. This is not easy to do in the current security situation, but we will and we must. The Afghan people are proud of their right to vote, and they're risking their lives to claim that right. By casting a vote, we as a nation are marking the commitment to democracy, so that peace will be maintained through the ballot, not bullet. 4, the government, with the support from the international community, must continue to earnestly and diligently implement President Ghani's rigorous, comprehensive reform agenda, which is articulated in Afghanistan's National Peace and Development Framework. We will present our progress on reforms and emphasize their centrality to peace at Geneva Ministerial Conference in November. Through reforms, we're improving governance excuse me. Through reforms, we're improving governance, rule of law, and service delivery, thus rebuilding the bruised and battered social contract between the Afghan government and the Afghan people. The goal is to reform institutions to serve the Afghan people and create citizens-focused governance and trust building. I'd like to thank your colleague here, Bill Bird, for being one of the only analysts in Washington or anywhere to scrutinize some of those very important reforms. They are a critical part of sustaining peace. I want to emphasize rule of law, justice, and anti-corruption here, which are hugely underestimated components of peace. Criminality and warlordism come from a legacy of violence that my generation is grappling with now. There are groups of individuals who have gotten very wealthy from this war and continue to. There are warlords and strongmen who continue to terrorize the Afghan people and perpetuate a culture of impunity and corruption. Such criminals also include the drug mafia, who perpetuate the conflict and corruption. The drug trade and the transnational criminal networks are responding to a global demand, and thus the issue requires a global response. We cannot overlook these issues. It's not easy, and it takes time to bring systematic and sustainable changes, but we are seeing progress already from the government's anti-corruption and justice sector reforms efforts, and we are pushing forward with support from the international community. In short, we must confront impunity, terror, violence in all its forms. 5, we must continue to build the Afghan national defense and security forces to ensure strong defense of citizens and our nation. We will continue to pursue a military campaign against those combatants who simply are not reconcilable and have no place in Afghan society or politics. Those include Daesh, Al-Qaeda elements, and other foreign fighters. 6, we must create economic opportunities, especially for those marginalized, including youth, women, and those living in poverty. You've seen the numbers, and we just spoke about it a few minutes ago. Almost half of children in Afghanistan remain out of school because of conflict. And the number of those living in poverty increased since 2012. We will continue to invest in our people's welfare with education, healthcare, and economic prospects so that any peace deal we reach will not be in jeopardy. These are the essential elements, and the government is proceeding on each front simultaneously. In terms of a peace deal, what we have, the Afghan government and people put on the table. Earlier this week, the High Peace Council convened a gathering of over 3,000 Islamic scholars from across Afghanistan. They issued a fatwa against suicide attacks and terrorism and called for a ceasefire. Today, President Ghani showed the government strong support for that unprecedented fatwa by ordering a ceasefire against the Afghan Taliban from the 27th of Ramadan until the 5th day of Eid al-Fitr. Our operations, however, will continue against Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and all other transnational terrorist groups. The ANDSF will take action if attacked and will continue to protect civilians. However, we will not target Afghan Taliban during the ceasefire. President Ghani's decision to declare ceasefire is rooted in the government's firm commitment to peace and is an act of support for the fatwa issued by the ulama. This follows President Ghani's unconditional offer of peace to the Taliban at the Kabul Process Conference in February this year. There is now a national and also international consensus for peace. In May, Indonesia hosted a conference of Islamic scholars from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Indonesia in support of the Afghan peace process. Similar gatherings will follow to maintain the momentum gathered by the international community in working for peace. The Afghan people are also absolutely fed up with being caught in the crossfire. I am 34 years old, and I have never seen a day of peace in my country in my entire life. My generation is absolutely fed up with this, and we are deeply invested in peace. It unites us. Peaceful civilian protests and sit-ins around the country have emerged from Helmand, Kandahar, Nangarhar, Herat, and Kabul. A group of young men marching to Kabul, one of them on crutches, from Helmand to Kabul to protest violence will reach the capital city in the next few weeks. They will be warmly welcomed by young peace activists and all citizens of Kabul city. Afghans want peace, and my generation are taking risks to stand for it. These Afghans and our security forces are our heroes. And we must say, what has the Taliban put on the table? Further death and destruction. Since January, they have pursued a brutal new strategy of directly targeting civilians in crowded urban spaces, killing hundreds of innocent Afghans. Shortly after the Afghan ulama issued a fatwa against terrorism, this week they were attacked. Taliban have attacked hospitals, schools, school children, sport games, civil society organizations, media and journalists, and citizens registering to vote. Moving forward, we must stay the course of building our security forces and maintaining pressure on the Taliban while we keep the door open for peace talks. At the same time, we must continue to earnestly implement our reforms agenda to deal head-on with corruption in our government, to deliver services, and to offer economic opportunities. We must repair the social contract between the Afghan people and the government. Peace building is an interconnected process that is at once urgent, yet at the same time complex and multi-layered. If we ignore any part of this puzzle, we risk compromising its legitimacy and sustainability. We are looking now to other countries that have dealt with same issues, such as Colombia. I'll also take this opportunity to make a request to my distinguished colleagues here today. Your knowledge on Afghanistan is perhaps unrivaled in the United States. So please use your expertise to also examine and think about these building blocks of peace and continue to contribute to in a constructive way to the Afghan-led peace-building efforts. I thank you all once again for your contribution to this important issue and USIP for organizing this in many other conferences in support of the Afghan-led peace initiative. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mohib, for those very powerful closing remarks. I was sitting there thinking we should have probably named this thing a long discussion about the long search for peace in Afghanistan. So thank you all very much for sticking with us, bearing with us today for this very important discussion. Again, a special thanks to Lisa Curtis for joining us this morning, taking time out of her busy schedule, and for Ambassador Mohib for coming here straight from the airport in time to make those remarks. Thanks to our panelists very much for your very interesting and important remarks, certainly highlighting many of the challenges, but also talking about some of the prospects for peace moving forward. I'd like to thank all of you and those who joined us online, and leave you again with USIP's tagline that peace is possible. Again, let's not be so skeptical about the challenges that we forget that. So thank you once again for joining us today.